35 disturbing true crime cases to fall asleep to. Junko Faruta, Japan. 44 days of torture by classmates, unimaginable cruelty. But this is not a story about gore. It's a story about the human mind, how it can be twisted, how it can be silenced, and how entire communities can become complicit in a nightmare they refuse to see. In November 1988, Junko was a 17-year-old high school student. Bright, ordinary, the kind of person whose life should have been defined by exams, friendships, and the quiet anticipation of adulthood. Instead, her name became a whispered legend in Japan, a case so disturbing that even decades later, it is spoken of in fragments, as if saying too much might summon the darkness again. The facts are known, but the psychology behind them is the real mystery. How could classmates, boys her own age, inflict such prolonged cruelty? How could neighbors, parents, even police, sense something was wrong and yet do nothing? This is where the story shifts from crime into something more insidious. The collective blindness of a society when faced with evil it does not want to acknowledge. Psychologists call it diffusion of responsibility, the idea that when many people are aware of a problem, each assumes someone else will act. But in Junko's case, it went deeper. There were reports that some adults knew, that the house where she was held was not entirely silent, that her suffering was not invisible, and yet, silence reigned. Why? Part of the answer lies in group psychology. When cruelty is normalized within a small group, it becomes its own reality. The perpetrators stop seeing their victim as human. They create a closed world where empathy is a weakness and dominance is the only currency. This is sometimes called de-individuation, when people lose their sense of personal responsibility because they are acting as part of a group. But there's another layer, the cover-up. Not an official one, but a social one. In tightly knit communities, shame can be more terrifying than justice. Admitting the truth means admitting that the community failed, that parents failed, that the police failed. And so, the truth is buried, not in files, but in silence. This is where the mystery deepens. Because silence is not neutral. It is active. It protects the guilty and erases the victim. Junko's ordeal lasted 44 days. That number is burned into the memory of anyone who has heard her story. But what is less discussed is the psychological toll of those days, not just on her, but on the people who knew and did nothing. For Junko, the human brain under extreme trauma enters survival mode. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, fires constantly. The prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and decision-making, is overwhelmed. Time distorts. Days blur. The body becomes a vessel for pain, and the mind retreats into fragments of thought, memory, and hope. For the bystanders, a different psychology takes hold. Cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs, forces them to rationalize their inaction. It's not my business. It can't be that bad. Someone else will handle it. Each excuse is a brick in the wall that keeps the truth out. And yet, the truth has a way of seeping through cracks. Rumors spread, whispers grow, but without action, they become nothing more than ghost stories, haunting but powerless. When Junko's body was finally discovered, the shock was immediate. But the deeper shock came later, as the details emerged, not just of what was done to her, but of how many people had been close enough to stop it. This is where the intrigue lies, not in the brutality itself, but in the human capacity to look away, in the unspoken agreements that keep horrors hidden, in the way a community can choose the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of truth. Some psychologists compare cases like Junko's to the Lord of the Flies syndrome, where isolation and group dynamics strip away morality. But in this case, the island wasn't remote. It was a neighborhood, a city, a society. And here's the most unsettling part. The mechanisms that allowed Junko's suffering to continue are not unique to Japan in 1988. They exist everywhere, in every culture, in every era. The same psychological forces that silenced her story can silence others, whether it's abuse behind closed doors, corruption in plain sight, or injustice that everyone sees but no one confronts. The cover-up is not always a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just the sum of 1,000 small silences. In the years since, Junko's name has become a symbol, not just of cruelty, but of the danger of inaction. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What would I have done if I had known? Would I have spoken up? Or would I have convinced myself it wasn't my place? The mystery is not who hurt her. We know their names. The mystery is why so many others didn't help. And maybe that's the part we don't want to solve. Because if we admit the answer, we have to admit that the same thing could happen again. That it is happening somewhere right now. Junko's story is a mirror. It reflects not just the faces of her tormentors, but the faces of those who looked away. And when we look into that mirror, we have to decide whether we see ourselves among them. In the end, the psychology of this case is not about monsters. Monsters are easy to identify. It's about ordinary people, classmates, neighbors, parents, who became part of something monstrous by doing nothing. That is the true horror. And that is why Junko Faruta's name must be spoken, not in whispers, but in warning. Because silence is the perfect cover-up. And the moment we stop speaking, the moment we stop looking, is the moment we allow the next 44 days to begin. Sylvia Likens, tortured by her caregiver and neighborhood kids, pure evil. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the human mind, how cruelty can grow in plain sight, how silence can become a shield for the guilty, and how an entire community can be drawn into a web of complicity without ever lifting a hand. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia was 16. She had a younger sister, Jenny. Their parents, traveling carnival workers, left them in the care of a woman named Gertrude Banaszewski. On paper, it was temporary guardianship. In reality, it became a slow descent into a nightmare that would last 3 months. The question that haunts this case is not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. How could a caregiver, someone entrusted with a child's safety, become the architect of such sustained cruelty? And how could others, including her own children and neighborhood kids, join in? Psychologists often point to authority bias, the tendency to obey or follow the lead of someone perceived as being in charge. In Gertrude's home, she was the unquestioned authority. Her word was law. When she directed her children to punish Sylvia, they obeyed. When she invited neighborhood kids to participate, they followed her lead. The moral compass of the group shifted, not toward empathy, but toward obedience to a warped figure of power. But authority bias alone doesn't explain the depth of the cruelty. There's also de-individuation, when people lose their sense of personal responsibility because they are acting as part of a group. In that house, cruelty became a shared activity. Each person's individual guilt was diluted by the presence of others. No one had to feel like the sole villain, because everyone's hands were dirty. And then there's the most unsettling layer, the bystander effect. Sylvia's suffering was not entirely hidden. People outside the house suspected something was wrong. Some even saw signs. But the human mind is skilled at rationalizing inaction. It's not my business. It's probably not as bad as it looks. Someone else will step in. Each thought is a small act of self-preservation, protecting the bystander from the discomfort of involvement. This is where the cover-up begins, not in official documents, but in the quiet decisions of ordinary people to look away. In tightly knit communities, there's a fear of shame, of scandal, of being the one to accuse a neighbor. Admitting the truth means admitting that the community failed, and so silence becomes the safest choice. For Sylvia, the psychological toll was unimaginable. Under prolonged abuse, the brain shifts into survival mode. The amygdala fires constantly, flooding the body with stress hormones. The sense of time distorts. Days blur. The mind retreats inward, clinging to fragments of hope or memory. In such conditions, even the smallest act of kindness, or the smallest act of cruelty, becomes magnified. For the perpetrators, a different transformation was taking place. Cruelty became normalized. The first act of violence is always the hardest. After that, repetition dulls the conscience. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, the process of convincing oneself that normal rules of right and wrong no longer apply. In Gertrude's house, moral disengagement was not just present, it was taught, reinforced, and rewarded. And yet, the most haunting mystery is not the psychology of the abusers, but the psychology of the witnesses. Why did no one stop it? Why did no one pull Sylvia out of that house? The answer lies in a mix of fear, denial, and the human tendency to protect one's own comfort over another's safety. When Sylvia died in October 1965, the truth came out quickly. Her sister Jenny, who had endured her own share of abuse, told police everything. The arrest followed. The trial revealed the depth of the cruelty, the number of participants, and the sheer scale of the inaction. But even then, the narrative was incomplete. The legal system focused on the individuals who had directly harmed Sylvia. The broader network of silence, the neighbors, the acquaintances, the people who suspected but did nothing, was never truly held accountable. This is the part of the story that lingers like a shadow, because the forces that allowed Sylvia's suffering to continue are not unique to 1965. They exist today in every community. The same psychological mechanisms, authority bias, de-individuation, the bystander effect, still shape human behavior. And that's what makes this story more than a historical tragedy. It's a warning. The cover-up in Sylvia's case wasn't a coordinated conspiracy. It was the sum of 1,000 small silences. Each person who looked away became part of the shield that protected her abusers. The intrigue lies in how ordinary people can become part of something monstrous without ever seeing themselves as villains. How a caregiver can transform into a ringleader of cruelty. How children can be taught to harm instead of help. How neighbors can convince themselves that what they hear through the walls is none of their concern. Sylvia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We like to believe that evil is rare, that it wears a clear face, that we would recognize it instantly and act against it. But in reality, evil often hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy, relying on the silence of those who don't want to get involved. The psychology of this case is not about monsters, it's about people. People who made choices, one after another, until those choices became a pattern, and that pattern became a tragedy. And here's the most chilling thought. The same pattern could happen again. It is happening again, somewhere, right now. The names are different. The faces are different. But the silence is the same. Sylvia Likens' name should not just be remembered as a victim of cruelty. It should be remembered as a test of whether we are willing to see what is uncomfortable, to speak when it is dangerous, to act when it is easier to look away. Because the real cover-up in her story was not in the courtroom. It was in the living rooms, the kitchens, the sidewalks of her neighborhood. It was in the minds of people who told themselves it wasn't their problem. And that is the part of the story that belongs to all of us. Sylvia's life ended in that house, but the psychology that allowed it to happen lives on. The only way to break it is to refuse the silence, to see, to speak, to act. Because the moment we stop speaking her name is the moment we allow the next Sylvia Likens to disappear behind closed doors. Chris Watts' family murders. A father kills his pregnant wife and daughters, betrayal at its core. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the human mind. How deception can be worn like a second skin. How a man can live two lives in plain sight. And how the truth can hide behind a smile until it's too late. In August 2018, Chris Watts appeared to be the picture of suburban normalcy. A steady job in the oil industry. A wife, Shanann, expecting their third child. Two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. Social media painted the image of a happy family. Vacations, birthday parties, affectionate captions. But behind that curated life, something darker was taking shape. The psychology of this case begins with dual identity. Watts maintained two versions of himself. The devoted family man and the man pursuing a secret relationship, craving a different life. Psychologists call this compartmentalization, the ability to separate conflicting parts of one's life so completely that each feels like its own reality. For months, he lived in both worlds, each unaware of the other. But compartmentalization has a cost. The more energy it takes to maintain the facade, the more pressure builds. And when the walls between those compartments begin to crack, the person is forced to choose which reality to preserve. In Watts' case, the choice was catastrophic. What makes this story so unsettling is not just the act itself, but the way he behaved before and after. In the days following his family's disappearance, Watts gave interviews to local news. He stood on his porch, pleading for their return, his words carefully chosen, his tone oddly flat. Experts in forensic psychology noted the absence of genuine emotion, what they call affective blunting. His body language was controlled, almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a role rather than living a crisis. This is where the mystery deepens. Was this emotional detachment a sign of guilt? Or was it the mask of someone who had long since disconnected from empathy? Some psychologists point to traits consistent with sociopathy: a lack of remorse, manipulative charm, and the ability to lie convincingly under pressure. Watt's calm demeanor, even as suspicion grew, suggested a man who believed he could control the narrative. In his mind, the cover-up was already in motion. And yet, the cover-up was not sophisticated. It relied less on elaborate deception and more on the assumption that people would believe the image he had built over years. This is the danger of impression management, when someone invests so heavily in appearing trustworthy that others hesitate to question them, even when the signs are there. The intrigue lies in how quickly that image unraveled. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in his story. Friends and family sensed something was off. The mask began to slip, and when it did, the truth came out in a flood. But the psychology doesn't end with Watts himself. There's also the question of how those around him, neighbors, co-workers, even law enforcement in the earliest hours, processed the situation. Humans are wired to avoid believing the worst about someone they know. This is normalcy bias, the tendency to assume that things will continue as they always have, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. It's why people often miss the early signs of danger. In the Watts case, normalcy bias worked in his favor, at least for a short time. His calmness, his insistence that everything would be fine, allowed him to maintain control of the narrative just long enough to try to erase the truth. But here's the deeper mystery. What was happening in his mind in the days and hours leading up to the murders? Financial stress, marital tension, and the pull of a new relationship all played a role. Yet many people face those pressures without crossing the line into violence. The difference lies in moral disengagement, the process of convincing oneself that harmful actions are justified. For Watts, this may have meant reframing his family not as loved ones, but as obstacles to the life he wanted. Once that mental shift occurs, empathy is no longer a barrier. The unthinkable becomes thinkable. And still, the cover-up fascinates. After the murders, Watts attempted to stage himself as the grieving husband. He spoke to reporters, texted friends, and even invited people into his home. This is staging in psychological terms, not just arranging a crime scene, but arranging one's behavior to fit a chosen narrative. The problem with staging is that it requires constant performance, and under stress, performances crack. When confronted with evidence, Watts' story changed. First, he claimed the deaths were accidental. Then, faced with irrefutable proof, he confessed. The shift from denial to admission was abrupt, almost mechanical, as if the confession was simply the next move in a game he had already lost. The intrigue here is not in the confession itself, but in what it reveals, that the cover-up was never truly about escaping justice. It was about buying time to maintain the illusion, time to avoid the collapse of the image he had built. In the end, the psychology of Chris Watts is a study in contrasts. Public warmth versus private detachment. A family man's smile masking a growing void. A man who could speak of love in one breath and commit betrayal in the next. And perhaps the most haunting part is how ordinary he seemed. No history of violence. No outward signs of instability. Just a man living in a quiet Colorado neighborhood, waving to neighbors, posting family photos online. This ordinariness is what makes the case so chilling, because it suggests that the capacity for such betrayal can exist beneath the surface of a life that looks perfectly normal. The mystery is not just why he did it, but how he could do it without anyone suspecting. How he could sit across from friends, hold his children, and plan a future, all while carrying the seed of destruction inside him. The cover-up failed. The truth came out, but the psychological questions remain. Was this the result of a sudden break, or a long, hidden erosion of empathy? Was it the pressure of living two lives, or the cold calculation of someone who saw people as pieces to be moved off the board? We may never have complete answers, but the Chris Watts case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles for the camera. Sometimes it waves from the driveway. Sometimes it wears the face of a father, a husband, a neighbor. And that is why this story lingers, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Because the most dangerous betrayals are not the ones we see coming. They are the ones that hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the mask can finally come off. Albert Fish, cannibalistic killer who sent letters to victims' families. But this is not a story about gore. It's a story about the human mind, about the shadows that can live inside it, the masks it can wear, and the strange compulsion to reveal the very secrets it tries to hide. In the early 20th century, Albert Fish appeared to some as nothing more than a frail, eccentric old man. He blended into the background of New York City life, his gray hair and quiet demeanor making him seem harmless. But beneath that exterior was a mind shaped by trauma, obsession, and a hunger for control that defied comprehension. The psychology of Fish begins in childhood. He grew up in an environment steeped in instability, poverty, loss, and abuse. Psychologists often speak of early imprinting, the way formative experiences carve deep grooves into the developing mind. For Fish, those grooves were filled with pain and humiliation. Over time, pain became intertwined with pleasure in his psyche, a distortion that would define his adult life. He developed what experts call paraphilic disorders, deviations in sexual arousal patterns that fixate on atypical objects or acts. But in Fish's case, these weren't fleeting impulses. They became the architecture of his identity. He cultivated them in secret, feeding them with fantasy until they demanded reality. And yet, the most chilling part of his story is not simply what he did. It's how he chose to communicate it. Fish sent letters to the families of his victims. Not anonymous threats, not vague confessions, but detailed, deliberate accounts. This is where the mystery deepens. Why would a man who had evaded capture for years risk everything by writing to the very people who could lead police to him? One theory lies in compulsion. Some offenders experience what psychologists call the need to relive. The act itself is not enough. They must revisit it, replay it, and in some cases, share it. For Fish, the letter was not just a confession. It was a performance, a way to assert dominance over his victims' families, to control their emotions long after the crime was done. But there's another layer, narcissistic exhibitionism. Fish may have believed himself untouchable, convinced that his frail appearance and unassuming life would shield him from suspicion. The letter became a stage, and the audience was forced to read every word. In his mind, the horror he described was not just an admission, it was a legacy. The cover-up in this case was not the absence of evidence, but the camouflage of normalcy. Fish lived in plain sight. He worked odd jobs. He visited friends. He was, to most, forgettable. This is the paradox of certain offenders. Their very ordinariness becomes their disguise. And yet, the disguise was never perfect. There were whispers, strange behaviors, unsettling comments, moments when the mask slipped. But here, the bystander effect played its role. People dismissed the signs. They told themselves it was eccentricity, not danger. This is the same psychological mechanism that allows communities to overlook the warning signs of abuse, corruption, or violence. It's easier to believe in harmlessness than to confront the possibility of evil. Fish's eventual capture came not from a sudden slip, but from his own need to be known. The letter he sent to Grace Budd's mother was his undoing. Investigators traced it back to him, and the quiet old man was revealed for what he truly was. But even in custody, the intrigue continued. Fish spoke openly about his crimes, yet often in ways that blurred fact and fantasy. This is a hallmark of pathological lying, the weaving of truth and invention until even the speaker may not fully distinguish between them. For law enforcement, this created a puzzle. How much of what he said was real, and how much was designed to manipulate, to shock, to control the narrative? The mystery of Albert Fish is not just in the acts themselves, but in the psychology that drove him to announce them. Most offenders hide. Fish reached out. Most fear exposure. Fish seemed to crave it. This inversion of expected behavior is what makes his case so unsettling to psychologists and criminologists alike. There's also the question of self-mythologizing. By writing those letters, Fish was not just confessing. He was crafting a story about himself. A story in which he was both the villain and the narrator, the one who decided how the tale would be told. In doing so, he ensured that his name would be remembered, not just as a criminal, but as a figure of enduring infamy. And here lies the final layer of intrigue, the possibility that the letters were as much about identity as they were about cruelty. For a man whose life had been defined by powerlessness in childhood, the act of writing, of forcing others to read his words, may have been the ultimate reclamation of control. The cover-up, then, was never about hiding the truth entirely. It was about controlling when and how it emerged. Fish's life was a balancing act between concealment and revelation, between the mask and the performance. In the end, Albert Fish's story is not just about a killer. It's about the dangerous intersection of trauma, compulsion, and ego. It's about how a person can live unnoticed for decades, carrying within them a reality so dark that it defies belief. And it's about how, sometimes, the need to be seen outweighs the need to stay free. The psychology of Fish forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. That evil can be quiet, that it can write letters in neat handwriting, that it can live next door, wave politely, and still carry secrets that would shatter the mind. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: the very thing that exposed him, the letter, was not a mistake. It was intentional, a final act of control, a final reminder that, in his mind, the story was his to tell. Because for Albert Fish, the crime was never truly over until someone else was forced to know it. And in that way, his legacy was not just in what he did, but in the way he made sure it could never be forgotten. The Toolbox Killers recorded torture of teenage victims, audio that still haunts investigators. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the human mind, how two men could find each other in the vastness of the world, recognize the same darkness in one another, and then feed it until it became something that would terrify even seasoned detectives. In the late 1970s, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were strangers. Each had his own troubled history, his own criminal record, his own fractured psychology. But when they met in prison, something clicked. Psychologists call this mutual reinforcement, when two individuals with similar deviant tendencies validate and escalate each other's impulses. Alone, each might have remained dangerous but contained. Together, they became something far worse. Their bond was built on shared fantasy. In the controlled environment of prison, those fantasies were just words. But once they were free, they began to turn them into reality. This is where the psychology shifts from thought to action. The human brain, once it has rehearsed an idea enough times, begins to normalize it. The line between imagining and doing becomes dangerously thin. What makes this case so uniquely disturbing is not just what they did, but how they documented it. They recorded the sounds of their victims' suffering. For most people, the idea of keeping such evidence would be unthinkable. But for Bittaker and Norris, the recordings were trophies, psychological anchors that allowed them to relive the power they felt in those moments. This is a phenomenon known as souvenir taking in criminal psychology. It's not about the object or the recording itself. It's about the emotional state it preserves. For them, the audio was proof of dominance, a way to revisit the experience without risk. But it was also a form of control. Even after the crimes were over, they could play those tapes and feel the same rush of power. The mystery lies in why they would risk keeping such damning evidence. Part of the answer may be arrogance. By the time they were deep into their spree, they believed themselves untouchable. This is criminal overconfidence, a cognitive distortion where repeated success in avoiding capture leads offenders to believe they are smarter than law enforcement, smarter than the system, smarter than everyone. But there's another layer. The recordings were not just for themselves. They played them for others. This is where the psychology turns even darker. Sharing the tapes was a way to spread the terror, to make others complicit in their knowledge. It was a performance, and the audience was forced to listen. When investigators finally heard the tapes, many described them as the most disturbing evidence they had ever encountered. Some could not finish listening. Even hardened professionals were shaken. This reaction speaks to the psychological contamination such material can cause. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. It lingers, not just as sound, but as an intrusion into the listener's own mental space. And yet, the cover-up in this case was not elaborate. Bittaker and Norris did not hide in shadows. They moved through public spaces, approached strangers, and operated in broad daylight. Their van, their methods, their movements, all were visible. This is the paradox. Sometimes the most dangerous predators hide not by being invisible, but by being ordinary. Neighbors saw them. Acquaintances spoke to them. But the human mind is reluctant to connect casual interaction with unimaginable evil. This is normalcy bias at work. the tendency to assume that things will continue as they always have, even when warning signs appear. People saw two men in a van, not two men hunting. The intrigue deepens when you consider how they were finally caught. It wasn't a dramatic chase or a sudden confession. It was a slow unraveling, triggered by someone who had been close enough to see the truth and decided to speak. This is the turning point in many cases, the moment when silence breaks. But why did it take so long? The answer lies in social proof, the psychological phenomenon where people look to others to determine how to act. If no one else is raising the alarm, individuals assume there is no reason to. In the case of the toolbox killers, their outward normalcy and the absence of public suspicion created a protective bubble. Even after their arrest, the mystery persisted. Why did they keep the tapes? Why did they share them? Why did they seem to take pride in the very evidence that would condemn them? Some criminologists believe it was about legacy. By preserving and sharing the recordings, they ensured that their crimes would not fade quietly into obscurity. In their twisted logic, infamy was a form of immortality. This is self-mythologizing, the act of shaping one's own narrative to leave a lasting mark, even if that mark is one of horror. For Whittaker and Norris, the tapes were not just evidence, they were the story they wanted told. And here is where the cover-up takes on a different meaning. It wasn't about hiding the crimes forever. It was about controlling the timeline of discovery. They decided when and how the truth would emerge, and until that moment, they lived as if nothing had happened. The psychology of the toolbox killers forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can be collaborative, that two people can find each other, recognize the same darkness, and amplify it until it consumes lives. It also forces us to see how ordinary the extraordinary can look, how predators can walk among us, unnoticed, because we are not looking for them in the faces of people who seem unremarkable. The tapes still exist, locked away, rarely heard. They are not played in courtrooms or public forums. They are too damaging, too haunting. But their existence is a reminder of the power of recorded memory, not just to preserve events, but to preserve the emotions tied to them. For investigators, those tapes are not just evidence. They are echoes of the moment when the mask of normalcy was ripped away. And perhaps the most chilling thought is this: without those recordings, without the arrogance that led to their preservation, the full scope of what Whittaker and Norris did might never have been known. The very thing that sealed their fate was the same thing they believed would keep their power alive. In the end, the mystery of the toolbox killers is not just about what they did, but about why they wanted it remembered. It's about the psychology of control, the seduction of legacy, and the dangerous illusion that evil can hide forever behind an ordinary face. Because sometimes, the most haunting part of a crime is not the act itself, but the way its perpetrators choose to make sure it is never forgotten. Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker, satanic serial killer who terrorized LA with random brutality. But this is not a story about the crime scenes. It's about the mind behind them, how chaos can be deliberate, how fear can be weaponized, and how a man could turn an entire city into a stage for his own dark mythology. In the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was a city of contradictions, sunlit beaches and shadowed streets, glamour and grit. Into this landscape stepped Richard Ramirez, a figure who seemed to defy the patterns of other killers. His attacks were random, different neighborhoods, different victim profiles, different methods. This unpredictability was not just a tactic, it was psychological warfare. The human mind craves patterns. Detectives, journalists, even the public, look for them instinctively. Patterns give us a sense of control, a way to predict what comes next. Ramirez shattered that. By striking without a clear type or method, he created a climate of pure uncertainty. No one could say, "I'm not his type." No one could feel safe. This randomness also served another purpose. It fed his self-image as an agent of chaos. Ramirez was not just killing, he was performing. He left behind satanic symbols, spoke of the devil, and wove occult references into his crimes. Whether or not he truly believed in the theology, he understood its power as theater. The symbols were psychological triggers, amplifying the terror beyond the physical acts. Psychologists studying Ramirez have pointed to his early life as a crucible for violence. He grew up in a home marked by volatility and abuse. As a boy, he was exposed to graphic violence through a cousin who had served in Vietnam, shown photographs of atrocities, and told stories that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. This early conditioning planted the seeds of desensitization, where violence became not shocking, but familiar. But familiarity alone doesn't explain the leap to what he became. That leap often requires reinforcement, and Ramirez found it in the form of escalating criminal behavior, petty theft, burglary, drug use. Each act chipped away at the boundaries of conscience. Over time, the moral lines dissolved entirely. What makes Ramirez's psychology so intriguing is the blend of impulsivity and calculation. On one hand, his drug use and erratic lifestyle suggest a man driven by immediate urges. On the other, his ability to evade capture for over a year, to move through the city without leaving a consistent trail, points to a predator who understood how to manipulate his environment. The cover-up in this case was not about hiding the crimes. They were loud, public, and meant to be noticed. The cover-up was about hiding himself. Ramirez blended into the urban sprawl. He was transient, moving between cheap hotels, acquaintances' homes, and the streets. He left no fixed address, no predictable routine. In a city of millions, he became just another face. And yet, he cultivated an image. When his name and face finally hit the news, it was clear he had been aware of his own notoriety. In court, he played to the cameras, smiling, flashing a pentagram drawn on his palm, declaring allegiance to Satan. This was self-mythologizing in its purest form, turning himself into a character larger than the crimes, ensuring that his name would live on in infamy. But here's the deeper mystery. How much of that persona was genuine belief, and how much was manipulation? Some criminologists argue that Ramirez used the satanic imagery as a smokescreen, a way to make his crimes seem even more incomprehensible, and therefore more terrifying. Others believe the belief system gave him a framework to justify his actions, to see himself as part of something greater than mere murder. The intrigue also lies in the city's reaction. Los Angeles in 1985 was gripped by fear. People changed their routines, locked their windows, bought weapons. The media coverage was relentless, and in that environment, Ramirez's legend grew. This is the feedback loop of fear. The more the public panicked, the more powerful the killer felt, and the more emboldened he became. When he was finally identified, it wasn't through a dramatic police raid, but through the eyes of ordinary citizens. His face, plastered across newspapers, was recognized on the street. The same public he had terrorized became the force that brought him down. This reversal is psychologically fascinating. The collective fear that had once paralyzed the city transformed into collective action. Even after his capture, the mystery persisted. Ramirez spoke openly about his crimes, yet often in ways that blurred fact and fiction. He seemed to enjoy the confusion, the inability of others to pin down his true motives. This is control through ambiguity. By never giving a clear answer, he kept the narrative in his hands. In prison, he became a figure of morbid fascination. Letters poured in from admirers, some drawn to the danger, others to the myth. This phenomenon, where certain criminals attract a following, is rooted in the psychology of transgression. For some, the allure lies in proximity to someone who has crossed every boundary, who embodies the rebellion against all norms. Ramirez understood this and leaned into it, further cementing his image. The cover-up, then, was never about erasing his identity. It was about controlling its shape. He wanted to be remembered not just as a killer, but as the Night Stalker, a name that carried with it the weight of fear, mystery, and the suggestion of something almost supernatural. And that is the final layer of intrigue. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror was as much about perception as it was about reality. The crimes were real, but the legend was crafted. He understood that fear is not just about what happens, it's about what people believe could happen. By making himself unpredictable, by cloaking his actions in symbols and chaos, he ensured that his shadow would loom larger than his physical presence ever could. The psychology of the Night Stalker forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can be both calculated and chaotic, that it can hide in plain sight while demanding to be seen. It shows us how a single individual can manipulate not just victims, but an entire city's sense of safety. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: The randomness that made him so terrifying was not random at all. It was a strategy, a way to make sure no one could ever feel beyond his reach. Because in the mind of Richard Ramirez, the real power was never just in the act of killing. It was in the fear that lingered long after, in the way his name could still make people glance over their shoulder decades later. The Hello Kitty murder, Hong Kong. Victim's skull found inside a Hello Kitty doll, surreal horror. But this is not a story about gore. It's about the human mind, how cruelty can hide in plain sight, how silence can shield the guilty, and how a single object, meant to symbolize innocence, can become the most haunting emblem of a crime. In 1999, Hong Kong was a city of neon lights and restless energy. Beneath the surface, it was also a place where the shadows of organized crime, addiction, and desperation intertwined. Into this world stepped Fan Manyi, a young woman whose life had already been shaped by abandonment and hardship. Raised in an orphanage, forced out as a teenager, she drifted into the city's underbelly, working as a nightclub hostess, battling addiction, and navigating a world where survival often meant compromise. Her path crossed with Chon Manlock, a man with ties to the triads, a drug dealer, and a figure who thrived on control. Their relationship was transactional, but in that world, transactions could turn dangerous. A dispute over money, small in the grand scheme, set events in motion. What followed was not just violence, but a sustained campaign of domination, humiliation, and psychological breaking. The psychology here is as disturbing as the acts themselves. This was not a momentary outburst of rage. It was prolonged, deliberate, and performative. In such cases, the abuse becomes ritualized. The perpetrators are not simply inflicting pain. They are reinforcing their own power, erasing the victim's identity piece by piece. And yet, the most surreal element came after her death. Her skull was placed inside a Hello Kitty doll. This was not random. In criminal psychology, such symbolic acts often serve as a form of narrative control. The object becomes a twisted trophy, a way for the perpetrators to rewrite the meaning of what happened. Hello Kitty, a global icon of childhood innocence, was transformed into a container for horror. It was a statement, intentional or not, that innocence itself had been corrupted. But the mystery deepens when we consider how the crime came to light. For weeks, no one knew. The apartment where she was held was in a busy district. Neighbors lived just beyond the walls. And yet, nothing was reported. This is the bystander effect in its most chilling form, not because people saw the acts directly, but because they sensed something was wrong and chose not to act. In dense urban environments, anonymity can be a shield for both the innocent and the guilty. The cover-up was not sophisticated. It relied on silence, on the assumption that no one would connect the dots. And for a time, that worked. The police only became involved when a teenage girl, herself entangled in the events, came forward. She claimed she was haunted by the ghost of the victim. Whether this was guilt, fear, or a genuine belief in the supernatural, it was enough to break the wall of secrecy. This detail adds another layer of intrigue. In many cultures, the idea of a restless spirit is tied to unresolved injustice. The girl's confession, framed through the lens of haunting, was both a psychological release and a cultural narrative. It gave her a way to speak the unspeakable, to shift the burden from her own conscience to something otherworldly. When investigators entered the apartment, they found the Hello Kitty doll. Inside the skull, the image alone was enough to sear itself into the public imagination. It became the defining symbol of the case, not the faces of the perpetrators, not the courtroom sketches, but that doll. From a psychological standpoint, the doll's presence in the apartment suggests more than just concealment. It may have been a way for the perpetrators to desensitize themselves to what they had done, to turn the remains into something they could live alongside without confronting the full reality. This is cognitive reframing, altering the meaning of something to make it more tolerable. In their minds, perhaps, the doll was no longer a toy, no longer a symbol of innocence, but an object that belonged to them, stripped of its original meaning. The intrigue also lies in the cultural dissonance. Hello Kitty is a brand built on cuteness, harmlessness, and global appeal. To see it linked to such brutality created a psychological whiplash for the public. It was as if two incompatible realities had been forced together, and the result was something that felt almost unreal. This surreal quality is part of why the case still lingers in memory. It doesn't just horrify, it unsettles the very way we categorize the world. The trial revealed the details, but it also revealed the limits of justice. The perpetrators were convicted, but the sentences left many feeling that the punishment did not match the crime. This is another form of cover-up, not the hiding of the act, but the dilution of its consequences. When justice feels incomplete, the story never truly closes. And so the Hello Kitty murder remains suspended between fact and legend. The facts are documented. The victim, the perpetrators, the timeline. But the legend is what people remember. The doll, the haunting, the sense that something this grotesque should have been impossible in the middle of a bustling city. From a psychological perspective, the case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That cruelty can be sustained over time without intervention. That symbols can be twisted into their opposites. That the line between the ordinary and the unthinkable is thinner than we want to believe. The cover-up here was not a grand conspiracy. It was the sum of small silences, of people not asking questions, of a city too busy to notice what was happening behind closed doors. And that is perhaps the most haunting part, because it means the conditions for such a crime are not unique to Hong Kong in 1999. They exist anywhere that silence is easier than confrontation. The Hello Kitty doll still stands as the most enduring image of the case. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with darkness and menace. Sometimes it hides inside something bright, familiar, and harmless. And when it does, the shock is not just in the act, but in the betrayal of what we thought we knew. In the end, the Hello Kitty murder is not just a story of violence. It is a story of power, of symbols, of the human capacity to look away, and of the strange ways truth can surface, sometimes through confession, sometimes through superstition, and sometimes through the most surreal object imaginable. Because in this case, the most chilling thing was not the crime itself, but the way it was contained, inside a smiling cartoon face, staring back at a world that could not comprehend what it was hiding. The Turpin family, 13 siblings held captive by their own parents, systemic abuse hidden in plain sight. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the psychology of control, the mystery of how such cruelty could endure for years without intervention, and the quiet cover-up that comes not from conspiracy, but from silence. In 2018, the world learned of a home in Paris, California, that police would later call a house of horrors. Inside were 13 siblings, ranging in age from toddlers to adults, all held captive by their own parents, David and Louise Turpin. To neighbors, the family seemed unusual but not alarming. Matching outfits, rare appearances outside, a quiet presence on the street. On social media, carefully staged photos showed smiling children, family trips, and a life that looked eccentric but intact. This is where the psychology begins. The Turpins had constructed a facade, a curated image that masked the reality inside. In abusive systems, this is known as impression management, the deliberate crafting of an outward identity to deflect suspicion. The matching clothes, the posed photos, the private school registered at their home. All of it was part of a narrative designed to keep questions at bay. Behind closed doors, the reality was one of extreme deprivation. The children were malnourished, chained, denied basic hygiene, and kept on a nocturnal schedule to avoid detection. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was structured, ritualized control. Psychologists describe this as coercive control, a pattern of domination that erodes autonomy over time. It's not just about physical restraint. It's about reshaping a person's sense of reality until they no longer believe escape is possible. One of the most haunting aspects is how the children's perception of the outside world was manipulated. Isolated from peers, denied education beyond rote memorization, they were taught that the world was dangerous, that outsiders could not be trusted. This is a form of learned helplessness, when repeated exposure to inescapable abuse convinces the victim that resistance is futile. Over years, this mindset becomes a prison more binding than chains. The mystery lies in the parents' motivations. There was no clear financial gain, no obvious ideological cult. Experts have speculated about possible psychopathology, narcissistic delusions, shared psychosis, or deeply ingrained paranoia. The Turpins appeared to operate in a closed psychological loop, reinforcing each other's worldview. In such dynamics, reality becomes self-contained. Outside norms no longer apply. And yet, the cover-up was disturbingly effective. The family lived in a suburban neighborhood. Delivery drivers came to the door. Extended relatives saw the children on rare occasions. But the signs, malnourishment, withdrawn behavior, the absence of normal schooling, were either missed or rationalized away. This is the bystander effect amplified by social distance. When something feels off, but no one feels it's their place to intervene. The turning point came when a 17-year-old daughter escaped through a window and called the police. Her voice, recorded on the emergency call, was hesitant, unsure. She had never spoken to a stranger on the phone before. That moment was the collapse of years of conditioning, a break in the psychological walls her parents had built. When officers entered the home, they were struck by the contrast between the staged family image and the reality before them. The children, some legally adults, appeared much younger due to malnutrition. The home was filthy, the air heavy. It was as if the curated photographs had been a portal to an entirely different universe, one that never existed. The intrigue deepens when we consider how the system failed them for so long. The Turpins had registered their home as a private school, with David as principal. This allowed them to avoid the oversight that might have come from public education. In effect, they used the legal framework meant to protect educational freedom as a shield for abuse. This is a form of structural cover-up, not an intentional conspiracy by authorities, but a gap in the system that allowed harm to remain hidden. Even after rescue, the psychological impact on the siblings was profound. Years of isolation had stunted not only their physical growth, but their social and emotional development. Some struggled with basic life skills, navigating a grocery store, crossing a street, understanding money. This is the long shadow of systemic abuse. It doesn't end when the doors are opened. The mind must relearn what freedom means. The parents' control extended beyond the physical. They reportedly used food as both a weapon and a lure, placing pies or treats in sight, but forbidding the children to touch them. This is psychological torment through deprivation, a tactic designed to keep the victims' focus on the abuser's permission rather than their own needs. It reinforces dependency, making the abuser the sole source of relief. The case also forces us to confront the unsettling truth that abuse can thrive in environments that look normal from the outside. The Turpins' home was not in a remote wilderness or a fortified compound. It was on a quiet street, surrounded by other families. This proximity to normal life is part of what makes the story so disturbing. It challenges the comforting belief that such horrors are always far away, in places we can easily avoid. The cover-up, in the end, was a combination of deliberate deception and societal blind spots. The parents controlled the narrative within their home, while the outside world accepted the surface image without probing deeper. It's a reminder that evil often hides not in the shadows, but in the spaces where no one is looking closely. The mystery that lingers is why. Why sustain such cruelty for so long? Why keep the children alive, but in such a diminished state? Some experts suggest it was about absolute power, the satisfaction of controlling every aspect of another person's existence. Others point to possible delusional beliefs, a warped sense of family, or the replication of abuse from their own pasts. But the truth may be that no single explanation can fully account for it. What is clear is that the Turpin case is not just a story of individual cruelty. It's a story about systems. Systems of law, education, and community that can be manipulated or bypassed. Systems of psychology that can bind victims to their abusers. And systems of perception that allow us to accept the surface of things without questioning what lies beneath. In the aftermath, the siblings began the long process of recovery. Some embraced education for the first time, others struggled with the sudden exposure to a world they had been taught to fear. Their journey is a testament to resilience, but also a reminder that freedom is not just the absence of chains, it's the presence of trust, autonomy, and the ability to shape one's own life. The Turpin family's story endures because it forces us to look at the uncomfortable intersection of secrecy and normalcy. It shows how abuse can be hidden not by distance, but by proximity. And it warns us that the most effective cover-ups are not always elaborate. They are often as simple as a smile for the camera, a closed door, and a world that doesn't want to look too closely. Because in the end, the greatest mystery is not how the Tippins kept their children captive for so long. It's how so many others, so close by, never saw enough to set them free. The Ken and Barbie killers, sadistic couple, filmed their crimes, smiling through the horror. But this is not a story about the crime scenes. It's about the psychology of two people who found in each other not love, but a mirror for their darkest impulses. It's about the mystery of how beauty and brutality can coexist in the same frame, and the cover-up that allowed their crimes to unfold in plain sight. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka looked like the perfect couple. Attractive, photogenic, the kind of pair you might see in a magazine ad for a dream wedding. To the outside world, they were young, in love, and living a life that seemed enviable. But behind closed doors, they were building something far more sinister. A partnership rooted in domination, sadism, and control. The psychology of their bond is as disturbing as the acts themselves. In criminal profiling, there's a phenomenon known as mutual psychopathy, when two individuals with compatible deviant tendencies amplify each other's behavior. Alone, each might have remained dangerous but contained. Together, they became something exponentially worse. Bernardo's predatory nature found validation in Homolka's willingness to participate, and Homolka's desire to please and control found an outlet in Bernardo's escalating fantasies. What makes their story uniquely chilling is the way they documented it. They filmed their crimes, not in secret, but with full awareness of the camera. They smiled, they laughed, they played the roles of lovers even as they inflicted suffering. This is performative sadism, violence staged not just for the act itself, but for the pleasure of replaying it, of preserving the power dynamic forever on tape. The tapes became the most haunting evidence in the case, but they also became the center of one of the most controversial cover-ups in Canadian legal history. When the recordings were first discovered, they were withheld from prosecutors for months by a defense attorney. By the time they were revealed, Carla Homolka had already secured a plea deal, portraying herself as a reluctant participant, coerced by Bernardo's control. The tapes told a different story, showing her as an active, even enthusiastic, accomplice. But the deal stood. This is where the intrigue deepens. The justice system had, in effect, locked itself into a narrative before all the evidence was on the table. Homolka's sentence, just 12 years, was a fraction of what it might have been had the tapes been seen earlier. To the public, it felt like a betrayal, a manipulation of truth that left one half of the duo walking free while the other faced life in prison. From a psychological standpoint, Homolka's ability to present herself as a victim while concealing her active role is a study in impression management. She understood how to appear cooperative, remorseful, and sympathetic. She leveraged societal biases, particularly the tendency to see women as less capable of extreme violence, to her advantage. And it worked. Bernardo, by contrast, seemed to revel in his notoriety. His charm, once used to lure victims, became a weapon in court and in prison interviews. He had studied manipulation like a craft, learning how to disarm suspicion with a smile, how to project confidence even under scrutiny. This is psychopathic charisma, the ability to mimic warmth and sincerity without feeling them. The mystery that lingers is how two people could maintain such a facade for so long. Friends, family, and co-workers saw them as a glamorous couple. There were no obvious signs of the darkness beneath. This is the danger of surface normalcy, the assumption that beauty, success, and charm are incompatible with evil. In reality, those traits can be the perfect camouflage. The tapes themselves are rarely discussed in detail, not because of their content alone, but because of the psychological weight they carry. Investigators who viewed them described the experience as deeply unsettling, not just for what was happening, but for the casualness with which it was done. The smiles, the laughter, the domestic intimacy woven into acts of cruelty. It blurred the line between the ordinary and the monstrous. And that blurring is key to understanding the case. Bernardo and Homolka didn't live in a constant state of violence. They had dinners, went shopping, attended family events. They could be affectionate, playful, even mundane. This intermittent normalcy made their crimes harder to detect and, in some ways, more disturbing. It showed that the darkness wasn't a constant frenzy. It was a choice, turned on and off at will. The cover-up wasn't just legal. It was social. People who knew them didn't want to believe what they were capable of. Even after their arrest, some clung to the idea that Homolka had been a victim, that the beautiful young woman in the wedding photos couldn't possibly have been a willing participant. This is cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs, resolved by rejecting the one that feels too disturbing to accept. In the years since, Homolka's release has reignited debates about justice, rehabilitation, and the limits of plea bargaining. She has lived under new identities, moved between communities, and faced public outrage whenever her past is uncovered. Bernardo remains in prison, his name synonymous with predation. But the tapes, their smiling faces, their casual cruelty, remain locked away, a reminder of the truth that was almost buried. The intrigue of the Ken and Barbie killers lies not just in what they did, but in how they managed to do it for so long without suspicion, and how one of them walked away with a fraction of the punishment. It's a story about the power of appearances, the fragility of truth in the face of manipulation, and the unsettling reality that evil can look like a perfect couple posing for a camera. From a psychological lens, their partnership was a closed system of reinforcement. Each act of cruelty bonded them further. Each shared secret deepened their complicity. In that sense, the tapes were not just evidence. They were a form of intimacy, a shared creation that no one else could fully understand. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. For Bernardo and Homolka, the horror was not a rupture in their relationship, it was part of its foundation. The smiles on those tapes were not masked for the camera. They were real, in the sense that they reflected the pleasure they took in each other's approval. The Ken and Barbie killers force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself with rage or menace. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it wears a wedding dress and a tuxedo. Sometimes it films itself, not to confess, but to remember. And in the end, the greatest cover-up was not the withholding of the tapes, or the plea deal, or the legal maneuvering. It was the illusion that they were ever anything other than what those tapes revealed. Two people, bound together by the darkest parts of themselves, smiling through the horror. Jonestown Massacre, over 900 dead in a cult-led mass suicide, blind devotion turned deadly. But this is not a story about the bodies in the jungle. It's about the mind, how one man's influence could bend reality for hundreds, how loyalty can be weaponized, and how the truth can be buried beneath layers of belief, fear, and control. In November 1978, the world awoke to the news from a remote settlement in Guyana. More than 900 members of the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones, were dead. They had fled the United States seeking a promised utopia, an escape from racism, inequality, and the corruption of modern life. What they found instead was a closed world where every thought, every movement, every relationship was filtered through the will of one man. The psychology of Jonestown begins with charismatic authority. Jim Jones was not just a preacher. He was a master manipulator of identity and belonging. He offered his followers a vision of a perfect society, free from the injustices they had known. In social psychology, this is called idealized influence, when a leader embodies the values they preach so convincingly that followers see them as the living proof of their own hopes. But charisma alone doesn't hold people forever. Jones layered it with isolation. By moving his followers deep into the Guyanese jungle, he cut them off from family, friends, and outside perspectives. In that isolation, he controlled the flow of information. Letters were censored. News from the outside world was filtered through his interpretation. This is information control, a cornerstone of coercive persuasion. Inside Jonestown, daily life was a mix of hard labor, public meetings, and constant surveillance. Members were encouraged to report on each other. Public confession sessions blurred the line between community and coercion. Over time, the group's shared reality shifted. Doubt became dangerous. Loyalty became survival. The mystery lies in how intelligent, compassionate people, teachers, nurses, activists, could come to accept the unthinkable. One answer is gradual escalation. Jones didn't begin with demands for ultimate sacrifice. He began with small commitments. More time, more work, more trust. Each step seemed reasonable in the moment, but each also made it harder to turn back. Psychologists call this the foot in the door effect. Once you've agreed to a small request, you're more likely to agree to a larger one. There was also the power of group conformity. In a closed environment, the opinions of those around you become the measure of reality. If everyone else appears to believe, to obey, to accept, it becomes harder to be the one who resists. In Jonestown, dissent was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. Those who questioned Jones risked public humiliation, punishment, or worse. The cover-up began long before the final day. Jones cultivated an image of Jonestown as a thriving, harmonious community. Visitors were shown staged performances of happiness. Letters home were dictated or edited. Even when concerns reached U.S. officials, the reports were mixed, some glowing, some alarming. The truth was obscured by a carefully managed facade. When Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in November 1978 to investigate, the cracks began to show. A handful of residents asked to leave with him. For Jones, this was the ultimate threat. The loss of control, the exposure of the reality he had built. What happened next has been called both a massacre and a mass suicide. Jones framed it as revolutionary suicide, a final act of defiance against a world he claimed would destroy them. Psychologically, this was the culmination of totalistic control. By that point, many followers saw Jones as the sole source of truth. He had convinced them that death was preferable to life outside Jonestown. In the chaos of that day, with armed guards present and the community gathered, the pressure to conform was overwhelming. In such moments, individual will can collapse under the weight of collective momentum. The intrigue lies in the layers of manipulation. Jones used fear of the outside world, love for the community, and the constant reinforcement of his authority to create a reality where the unthinkable became inevitable. Survivors describe a sense of mental fog, of decisions made in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and loyalty. Even after the tragedy, the cover-up continued in a different form. The narrative of Jonestown was simplified into a cautionary tale about drinking the Kool-Aid, reducing a complex web of psychological control, social isolation, and political neglect into a single, dismissive phrase. The deeper questions about how such control is built, how it can be recognized, and how it can be resisted were often left unexplored. From a psychological standpoint, Jonestown is a case study in the misuse of influence. Jones employed techniques that mirror those found in research on obedience, conformity, and persuasion, techniques that, in other contexts, can be used for good. The difference lies in intent. In Jonestown, every tool of influence was bent toward one goal: absolute control. The mystery that remains is how far the responsibility extends. Was it solely Jones, or did the structure of the group itself, its hierarchy, its culture of obedience, make the outcome possible? Could intervention have come sooner if warnings had been heeded? And how many other groups, less visible, operate on similar principles today? The Jonestown Massacre forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that blind devotion is not born overnight. It is cultivated step by step, in environments where questioning is punished, where the leader's voice drowns out all others, and where the boundaries between belief and reality are deliberately blurred. It also forces us to see that the most effective cover-ups are not always about hiding facts. They are about shaping perception. By the time the outside world saw Jonestown for what it was, the people inside had been living in a different reality for years. In the end, Jonestown is not just a story about death in the jungle. It is a story about the human need for belonging, the vulnerability of that need to exploitation, and the way a single voice, if given enough power, can rewrite the rules of life and death. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the techniques that built Jonestown are not relics of the past. They are alive in the world today, in cults, in extremist movements, in any place where loyalty is demanded above truth. The lesson is not just to remember what happened, but to recognize the signs before the next voice calls for devotion and leads it to destruction. Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. Munchausen by proxy leads to matricide, blurred lines of victimhood. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the mind, how years of deception can warp reality, how abuse can be hidden in plain sight, and how the line between victim and perpetrator can dissolve until it's almost impossible to see where one ends and the other begins. For most of her life, Gypsy Rose was presented to the world as a fragile, terminally ill child. Her mother, Dee Blanchard, told doctors, neighbors, charities, and even her own family that Gypsy suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, severe allergies, and countless other ailments. She was confined to a wheelchair, fed through a tube, and subjected to surgeries and medications she didn't need. The community rallied around them: donations, free housing, trips to Disney, meetings with celebrities. To the outside world, Dee was a devoted mother caring for a desperately sick daughter. But it was all a lie. Gypsy was the victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare and deeply disturbing form of abuse in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care, often for attention, sympathy, or control. In this case, Dee's deception was so complete that even Gypsy herself believed much of it for years. Her reality was curated by her mother, medical records altered, birth date falsified, doctors manipulated. The psychology here is chilling. Munchausen by proxy is not simply lying. It's a sustained performance that requires meticulous planning and constant reinforcement. Dee controlled every aspect of Gypsy's life: what she ate, where she went, who she spoke to, even what she thought about her own body. This is coercive control at its most insidious, where the victim's sense of self is dismantled and rebuilt according to the abuser's design. Isolation was key. Dee kept Gypsy away from peers, from extended family, from anyone who might question the narrative. She homeschooled her, accompanied her to every appointment, and intercepted conversations. In such an environment, the abuser becomes the sole source of truth. Over time, Gypsy's identity was not her own. It was a role she had been forced to play. The mystery lies in how this could go on for so long without intervention. Part of the answer is medical fragmentation. Dozens of specialists saw Gypsy, but each focused on their own area, rarely comparing notes. Dee's charm and apparent devotion disarmed suspicion. And when small doubts did arise, they were drowned out by the overwhelming image of a selfless mother caring for a dying child. But inside that carefully constructed world, cracks were forming. As Gypsy grew older, she began to notice inconsistencies. She could walk when her mother wasn't looking. She didn't feel sick in the way she was told she was. She secretly accessed the internet, connecting with people outside her mother's control. And then she met Nicholas Gojon online, a man whose own psychological complexities would intertwine with hers in a way that would change everything. Their relationship became a lifeline for Gypsy, but also a catalyst. In Nicholas, she found someone who believed her fears, validated her desire for freedom, and was willing to act. The plan they formed was desperate and irreversible: to kill Dee. Here is where the blurred lines of victimhood become most stark. Gypsy was undeniably a victim of years of abuse, manipulation, and medical torture, but she also became a participant in a violent act. This duality challenges our instinct to categorize people neatly as either innocent or guilty. In reality, trauma can create situations where those roles overlap, where survival and morality collide. From a psychological perspective, Gypsy's decision can be seen through the lens of learned helplessness. After years of failed attempts to assert independence, each met with punishment or further restriction, she may have believed that escape was impossible through normal means. The murder, in her mind, was not just an act of rebellion. It was the only path to freedom. The cover-up in this case was not about hiding the crime afterward. It was about the years of deception that preceded it. Dee's manipulation of medical professionals, her control over Gypsy's identity, and her ability to maintain the illusion of illness were all part of a long-term concealment of abuse. Even after Dee's death, the initial shock in the community was not that she had been killed, but that Gypsy had never been sick at all. The intrigue deepens when we consider how the justice system handled it. Gypsy was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison, a punishment that sparked debate. Was she a cold-blooded killer or a desperate victim acting under extreme psychological duress? Public opinion split sharply, with some seeing her as a symbol of resilience against abuse, and others as someone who crossed an unforgivable line. In interviews, Gypsy has spoken about the complexity of her feelings: grief for her mother, anger at the abuse, and a strange sense of relief at being free. This emotional ambivalence is common in survivors of long-term coercive control. The bond between abuser and victim can be paradoxical, containing both fear and attachment, love and resentment. The Gypsy Rose Blanchard case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse. It shows how easily appearances can deceive, how systems can fail to protect the vulnerable, and how trauma can shape choices in ways that defy simple moral judgment. It also reveals the psychological cost of living in a reality constructed by someone else, where even your own body is not truly yours. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is that this kind of abuse is not as rare as we'd like to believe. Munchausen by proxy thrives in the shadows, protected by the very trust we place in caregivers. It exploits the assumption that a mother's love is inherently selfless, turning that trust into a weapon. In the end, Gypsy's story is not just about a crime. It's about the slow erosion of autonomy, the power of narrative to shape reality, and the desperate measures people may take when every other door is closed. It's about a young woman who was both prisoner and conspirator, victim and agent of her own escape. The blurred lines remain. Was Gypsy's act one of liberation or one of destruction? The answer may depend on how we define justice, and whether we believe that survival can sometimes demand choices we cannot imagine until we are the ones trapped behind the locked door. Because in the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, the real cover-up was not the act of murder. It was the years of abuse hidden in plain sight, the smiling photographs, the staged hospital visits, and the carefully crafted illusion that fooled everyone, including Gypsy herself. The Moors murders, child-killing duo buried victims on the moors, cold and calculated. But this is not a story about the crime scenes. It's about the psychology of two people whose lives collided in a way that turned their darkest impulses into a shared mission, the mystery of how such evil could hide in plain sight, and the cover-up that allowed it to unfold for years before the truth emerged. In the early 1960s, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were, to the outside world, an ordinary couple in Manchester. They worked regular jobs, posed for photographs, and blended into their community. But behind closed doors, they were constructing a private world shaped by Brady's fascination with violence, control, and authoritarian ideologies, and Hindley's willingness to follow him into the abyss. The psychology of their partnership is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Brady was the architect, intelligent, manipulative, and obsessed with the idea of committing the perfect crime. Hindley, by all accounts, was not violent before meeting him. Yet under his influence, she transformed from a young woman with a conventional life into an active participant in abduction and murder. This transformation is a textbook example of coercive persuasion, where one person's worldview becomes so dominant in a relationship that the other adopts it as their own, even when it violates their previous moral boundaries. But this was not simple domination. There was a feedback loop. Hindley's devotion validated Brady's fantasies, and Brady's approval reinforced Hindley's loyalty. Together, they created a closed psychological system where cruelty was normalized and empathy was eroded. In such a system, each act of violence becomes easier than the last, and the bond between the perpetrators deepens with every shared secret. The choice of the moors as their burial ground was not just practical, it was symbolic. The vast, desolate landscape became part of their mythology, a place where they could hide their crimes in plain sight. From a psychological perspective, this is territorial control, claiming a space as part of the crime itself, turning it into a private stage for their acts. The moors were both a hiding place and a reminder of their power over life and death. The mystery lies in how they managed to operate without detection for so long. Their victims were children and teenagers, taken from public places. Families reported them missing. Police investigated. Yet Brady and Hindley remained invisible. Part of the answer is social camouflage, the ability to appear so ordinary that suspicion never sticks. Hindley's image as a polite, respectable young woman was a powerful shield. People simply did not imagine that someone like her could be capable of such acts. The cover-up was not just about hiding bodies. It was about controlling perception. They maintained their public personas meticulously. Hindley's neat appearance, Brady's quiet demeanor, their unremarkable home life. All of it worked to deflect attention. Even when they were questioned, they projected confidence and normalcy, exploiting the human tendency to trust appearances over intuition. Their downfall came not from a sudden slip, but from the involvement of others. A final murder, witnessed by an accomplice who went to the police, shattered the illusion. When investigators searched their home, they found photographs of the Moors, audio recordings of a victim's ordeal, and other evidence that stripped away the facade. Yet even after their arrest, the intrigue continued. Both denied full responsibility, each shifting blame onto the other. This is a common dynamic in criminal partnerships. Once the shared mission collapses, self-preservation takes over. The bond that once fueled their crimes becomes a battlefield of competing narratives. From a psychological standpoint, Brady's behavior in prison suggested a need to maintain control over the story. He gave selective interviews, hinted at undisclosed details, and withheld information about the location of one victim's body. This withholding is a form of narrative dominance, keeping a piece of the truth as a way to retain power over the living, even from behind bars. Hindley's trajectory was different. Over time, she attempted to recast herself as a reformed woman, claiming she had been manipulated and coerced. This raises the enduring question: was she a victim of Brady's influence, or an equal partner in his crimes? The answer is complicated. Psychological coercion can be real and devastating, but it does not erase agency. The tension between these two truths is part of what keeps the case alive in public memory. The Moors murders also reveal how the public processes evil. The image of Hindley, her platinum hair, her cold stare in police photographs, became an icon of female criminality in Britain. She was vilified in a way that Brady, though equally guilty, was not. This disparity speaks to societal expectations about gender and violence. When women commit acts of brutality, the shock is magnified, and the need to explain it becomes more urgent. The cover-up, in the broader sense, was not just theirs, it was also societal. For years, the idea that such crimes could be committed by people living ordinary lives was too uncomfortable to fully confront. The Moors themselves became a kind of silent witness, holding their secrets in the earth, a reminder that the worst horrors can be hidden in the most open spaces. The mystery that lingers is not only about the missing victim whose body was never found, but about the psychology that bound Brady and Hindley together. Was it love, obsession, or simply a shared appetite for control and cruelty? Did Hindley ever truly believe in Brady's worldview, or was her participation a way to hold on to him at any cost? These questions have no definitive answers, and perhaps that is why the case continues to fascinate and disturb. From a criminological perspective, the Moors murders are a study in the convergence of personality, opportunity, and influence. Brady's manipulative intelligence, Hindley's susceptibility to his approval, the social invisibility of their relationship, and the isolation of the Moors all combine to create the conditions for their crimes. Remove any one element, and the story might have ended differently. In the end, the Moors murders are not just about the lives they took, but about the lives they lived in between. How they could shop for groceries, chat with neighbors, and pose for photographs while carrying the weight of their secrets. It is this duality, the coexistence of the mundane and the monstrous, that makes the case so haunting. Because the real horror is not only in what they did, but in how long they were able to do it without anyone seeing who they truly were. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who look exactly like everyone else. The Cheshire home invasion, family tortured and murdered in their own home, nightmare scenario. But this is not a story about the crime scene. It's about the psychology of two men who turned a suburban dream into a calculated nightmare. The mystery of how such violence could erupt in a place built on safety, and the cover-up, not of evidence, but of intent, that allowed them to move through the world unnoticed until it was too late. In July 2007, Cheshire, Connecticut was the kind of town people moved to for peace. Tree-lined streets, good schools, neighbors who waved from their driveways. The Petit family fit the picture perfectly. William, a respected doctor, Jennifer, a nurse, their daughters Haley, 17, and Michaela, 11. It was the kind of life that seemed untouchable. But predators don't always come from the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us, blending into the background until the moment they decide to act. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were not strangers to crime. Both had long histories of burglary, theft and manipulation. Yet their crimes had, until then, been opportunistic, quick in-and-out jobs. What happened in Cheshire was different. It was deliberate, it was sustained, and it was psychological. The psychology of this case begins with target selection. Komisarjevsky spotted Jennifer and Michaela at a grocery store. He followed them home, noting the house, the neighborhood, the apparent affluence. This was not random, it was predatory surveillance. In criminal profiling, this is the moment when fantasy begins to merge with planning. The target becomes more than a house. It becomes a stage for control. When Hayes and Komisarjevsky entered the Petit home in the early hours, their initial plan, by their own accounts, was burglary. But burglary is impersonal. What unfolded was anything but. The shift from theft to prolonged violence suggests a deeper motive, the desire for dominance. In forensic psychology, this is power-oriented offending, where the act is less about material gain and more about asserting control over another human being. Control was the thread that ran through every decision they made. They restrained William in the basement, isolating him physically and psychologically. They kept Jennifer and the girls upstairs, using them as leverage. They sent Jennifer to the bank to withdraw money, knowing she would comply to protect her family. Every move was calculated to keep the victims compliant while feeding the offender's sense of mastery over the situation. The mystery lies in the escalation. Why didn't they leave once they had the money? Why prolong the ordeal? One answer is escalation through opportunity. Once inside, the offenders realized they could take more than possessions. The boundaries of their original plan dissolved, replaced by the intoxicating sense of total control. And yet, there was a cover-up of sorts, not in hiding the crime afterward, but in masking their true intentions during it. To the bank teller, Jennifer appeared frightened but hopeful, repeating that her family would be safe if she complied. This was the illusion the offenders maintained, that cooperation would lead to survival. In reality, the decision to kill had already begun to take shape. From a psychological perspective, both men brought different dynamics to the crime. Hayes was volatile, driven by impulse and aggression. Komisarjevsky was methodical, using manipulation and observation. Together, they formed a complementary partnership, one feeding off the other's strengths and weaknesses. This is co-offending synergy, where two individuals, each dangerous alone, become exponentially more so together. The cover-up extended beyond the victims. In their own minds, Hayes and Komisarjevsky reframed their actions to justify them. Offenders often engage in cognitive distortion, telling themselves the victims will recover, that the harm isn't as bad as it is, or that circumstances force their hand. These mental gymnastics allow them to continue without confronting the full reality of what they're doing. When the violence reached its peak, the decision to set the house on fire was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it was an attempt to destroy evidence. Symbolically, it was an erasure, wiping away the scene, the witnesses, the proof of what had happened. Fire, in criminal psychology, is often linked to cleansing or obliteration. In this case, it was the final act of control, deciding not only how the victims would die, but how their story would end. But the story didn't end there. William Petit escaped, injured but alive, and the truth began to unravel. The arrests were swift, but the trials revealed the deeper intrigue. Both men blamed each other for the escalation. Each painted himself as less culpable, more reluctant, more controlled by the other. This is a common post-crime dynamic in co-offending pairs. Once the shared goal is gone, self-preservation takes over. The trials also exposed the failures that allowed the crime to happen. Both men were on parole at the time. Both had histories that suggested a high risk of reoffending. Yet they were free, moving through the community without close supervision. This is the systemic cover-up, the quiet gaps in oversight, the unspoken assumption that past crimes don't always predict future ones. The psychological aftermath for the community was profound. Cheshire was forced to confront the reality that safety is often an illusion. The idea that such brutality could happen in a place like theirs shattered the mental barrier between safe and unsafe spaces. This is collective trauma, when an entire community's worldview is altered by a single event. For survivors like William Petit, the trauma was both personal and public. Every detail of the case was dissected in court, in the media, in conversations among strangers. Survivors of violent crime often speak of the second wound, the loss of privacy, the constant retelling, the way their lives become defined by the worst thing that ever happened to them. The Cheshire home invasion forces us to look at the uncomfortable intersection of opportunity, psychology, and systemic failure. It shows how two men, each with a history of crime, could find in each other the means to commit something far worse than either might have done alone. It shows how control, once taken, can become an end in itself. And it shows how the most dangerous cover-up is not the one that hides evidence, but the one that hides intent, until it's too late. In the end, the nightmare of Cheshire is not just that a family was destroyed in their own home. It's that the destruction was deliberate, sustained, and rooted in a need for power that went far beyond theft. It's that the warning signs were there, but unseen. And it's that the illusion of safety can be the most dangerous illusion of all, because it blinds us to the predators who are already inside the gates. Zodiac killer, taunting letters, cryptic codes, and no arrest, unsolved terror. But this is not a story about the crime scenes. It's about the mind behind the mask, the mystery of a phantom who turned murder into a performance, and the cover-up, not by institutions, but by the killer himself, layer upon layer of misdirection that has kept his identity hidden for decades. In the late 1960s, Northern California was a place of cultural upheaval, protests, counterculture, and a sense that the old rules no longer applied. Into this atmosphere stepped a figure who would exploit both the chaos and the media's hunger for sensation. The man who called himself Zodiac didn't just kill, he crafted a persona. He wanted to be seen, feared, and remembered. The psychology of the Zodiac begins with narcissistic exhibitionism. Unlike killers driven purely by compulsion or personal grievance, Zodiac craved an audience. His letters to newspapers were not confessions in the traditional sense. They were performances filled with boasts, threats, and elaborate ciphers. He wasn't content to act in the shadows. He wanted the spotlight, but only on his terms. This is where the mystery deepens. Most serial offenders avoid attention to prolong their freedom. Zodiac inverted that logic. By inserting himself into the investigation, he controlled the narrative. He decided what the public knew, when they knew it, and how it was framed. His cryptic codes weren't just puzzles. They were psychological traps, designed to make law enforcement and amateur sleuth chase meaning through a maze of symbols and half-truths. The ciphers themselves reveal another layer of his mind. They suggest schizotypal traits, a fascination with symbols, secret knowledge, and the idea that meaning can be hidden in plain sight. Whether or not he truly believed in the occult or numerology, he understood the power of suggestion. By embedding his crimes in a web of mystery, he ensured they would live on long after the physical evidence faded. And yet, the cover-up was not about hiding the acts. He wanted those known. The cover-up was about hiding himself. He shifted methods, locations, and victim profiles, breaking the patterns investigators rely on. He attacked couples in secluded areas, then a lone cab driver in the city. He used both guns and knives. This unpredictability was strategic. It blurred the behavioral profile, making it harder to link all the crimes definitively to one man. From a psychological warfare perspective, Zodiac's greatest weapon was fear. His threats to attack school buses, his claims of dozens of victims, his mocking of the police. All of it was designed to create a sense that he could strike anywhere, at any time. This is control through uncertainty. Even if he never carried out some of his threats, the possibility was enough to alter behavior across an entire region. The intrigue also lies in the possibility that not all of his claims were true. Some crimes he took credit for may not have been his. This tactic, claiming responsibility for unrelated acts, served two purposes. It inflated his perceived power, and it muddied the investigative waters. If police had to sift through false leads and unrelated cases, the real trail grew colder. The media became an unwitting accomplice in his performance. Every letter, every cipher, every taunt was printed, dissected, and broadcast. In doing so, they amplified his reach. This is the paradox of the Zodiac case. The very attention meant to help catch him also fed the persona he wanted to project. The cover-up extended into the investigation itself, not through conspiracy, but through the natural fragmentation of law enforcement at the time. Multiple jurisdictions were involved, each with their own evidence, suspects, and theories. Without centralized coordination, pieces of the puzzle remain scattered. Zodiac exploited this, knowing that a killer who crosses boundaries, geographic, methodological, and psychological, is harder to catch. The mystery that endures is not just who he was, but why he stopped, or if he did. Did he die, get arrested for another crime, or simply choose to vanish? Serial offenders rarely walk away without compulsion or capture. If Zodiac did, it suggests an extraordinary level of self-control or a shift in his needs that killing no longer satisfied. From a profiling standpoint, Zodiac's blend of traits is unusual. He showed the cold calculation of a planner, the theatricality of a narcissist, and the adaptability of someone who could read and manipulate public reaction. He was not impulsive in the traditional sense. His impulsivity was in his choice of targets and methods, not in his need for recognition. That recognition was carefully managed. The ciphers remain a focal point of intrigue. Some have been solved, revealing taunts and grandiose statements. Others remain unsolved, their meaning, if any, still debated. Were they genuine keys to his identity, or meaningless strings meant to waste time? This ambiguity is part of the genius of his cover-up. By leaving open the possibility that the answers were always there, he ensured the chase would never truly end. The Zodiac Killer forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most enduring crimes are those where the killer understands the psychology of the hunt as well as the psychology of the kill. He didn't just evade capture, he engineered a legend. And legends are harder to kill than men. Even decades later, the case draws new investigators, codebreakers, and theorists. Each believes they might be the one to see what others have missed. This is the final layer of his control. He turned the pursuit of justice into an endless puzzle, one that consumes time, energy, and obsession. The cover-up, then, is not a single act. It's the entire architecture of the case. The shifting methods, the false claims, the ciphers, the manipulation of media, the exploitation of jurisdictional divides. All of it built a wall between the man and the myth, a wall that has stood for over half a century. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. The Zodiac Killer may be gone, but the persona he created still stalks the public imagination. Every unsolved murder in Northern California from that era is viewed through his shadow. Every new cipher discovery reignites the chase. He achieved what few criminals ever do. He became a story that refuses to end. Because in the end, the Zodiac's greatest crime may not have been the lives he took, but the way he ensured that his name, his chosen name, would live on, unsolved, untouchable, and forever just out of reach. Madeleine McCann disappearance, global media frenzy, still no answers, haunting mystery. But this is not a story about the apartment in Praia de Luz or the physical search that followed. It's about the psychology of uncertainty, the mystery of a case that has resisted resolution for nearly 2 decades, and the layers of cover-up, intentional or accidental, that have kept the truth just out of reach. In May 2007, the McCann family was on holiday in Portugal. Madeleine was 3 years old. One evening, her parents left her and her younger siblings asleep in their apartment while they dined at a nearby restaurant with friends, checking in periodically. At some point between those checks, Madeleine vanished. What followed was not just an investigation. It was an international spectacle. The psychology of this case begins with the power of narrative. From the moment the story broke, it was shaped by competing versions of events. The parents' account, the police theories, the media's interpretations. In high-profile disappearances, the first narrative to take hold often becomes the lens through which all future evidence is viewed. In Madeleine's case, that lens was fractured almost immediately. The Portuguese police initially treated it as a missing child case, but as days passed without a ransom demand or credible sighting, suspicion shifted. The McCanns themselves were named as formal suspects before later being cleared. This shift created a psychological split in public opinion. Some saw grieving parents, others saw potential perpetrators. Once that division took root, every new detail was filtered through confirmation bias, reinforcing whichever side a person already believed. The mystery deepens when we examine the timeline contradictions. In cases like this, minutes matter. Who saw what, when, and in what order can make the difference between solving a case and losing it forever. But in Praia de Luz, witness statements varied, memories conflicted, and the sequence of events became muddled. This is not unusual. Memory is malleable, especially under stress, but it created fertile ground for doubt and conspiracy. Then there's the media amplification. The McCann case became a global story almost instantly. Photographs of Madeleine were everywhere. News outlets dissected every move the parents made, every word they spoke. This level of exposure can be a double-edged sword. It keeps the case alive, but it also distorts it. Rumors become headlines, speculation becomes fact in the public mind, and the sheer volume of information can overwhelm the actual evidence. The cover-up here is not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy. It's the way noise can bury signal. In the flood of tips, alleged sightings, and conflicting theories, the truth can be drowned. Investigators must sift through thousands of leads, many of them false, each one consuming time and resources. In such an environment, even the most promising clues can be lost. Psychologically, the case also reveals the human need for resolution. Unsolved mysteries create discomfort. We want to know what happened, to assign blame, to close the loop. When that closure doesn't come, we fill the void with theories. Some are plausible, others far-fetched, but all serve the same purpose: to make the unknown feel less threatening. In the McCann case, this has led to an extraordinary range of possibilities: abduction by a stranger, targeted kidnapping, accidental death and concealment, even organized trafficking. Each theory has its own internal logic, its own set of facts that supporters point to, and each is undermined by gaps, contradictions, or lack of definitive proof. This perpetual uncertainty is part of what keeps the case alive in the public imagination. It's not just about finding Madeleine. It's about the psychological pull of a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The intrigue is heightened by the jurisdictional complexity. The disappearance happened in Portugal, but the McCanns are British. Multiple police forces, legal systems, and investigative cultures became involved. Information was not always shared efficiently. Misinterpretations of forensic evidence, differences in procedure, and even language barriers all contributed to delays and missteps. In high-stakes cases, these cracks in coordination can be as damaging as any intentional cover-up. There's also the question of behavioral perception. The McCann's composure in public was, for some, a sign of strength. For others, it was suspicious. This is a common trap in public judgment. People expect grief to look a certain way, and when it doesn't, they assume deception. But trauma responses vary widely. Some people collapse, others become hyperfunctional. In the absence of clear evidence, these subjective interpretations can take on outsized importance. Over the years, new suspects have emerged. New searches have been conducted, and new forensic techniques have been applied. Each time, hope surges, only to fade when no definitive breakthrough comes. This cycle of anticipation and disappointment has its own psychological toll, not just on the family, but on the public following the case. It creates a kind of collective fatigue, where people begin to doubt that the truth will ever be known. And yet, the case refuses to fade. Part of that is because Madeleine's image, bright-eyed, smiling, became iconic. She is not an abstract statistic. She is a face people recognize. That recognition keeps the emotional connection alive, and with it, the drive to keep searching. The cover-up, if we can call it that, is layered. There is the possible concealment of key facts by someone directly involved. There is the unintentional obscuring of truth by the sheer volume of false leads. There is the systemic opacity created by multiple agencies working in parallel, but not always in sync. And there is the personal cover-up, the ways in which individuals, whether witnesses or suspects, may withhold information out of fear, guilt, or self-preservation. The Madeleine McCann disappearance forces us to confront the limits of investigation in the real world. It shows how quickly a case can become not just about what happened, but about what people believe happened. It shows how media attention can be both a searchlight and a fog. And it shows how, in the absence of resolution, mystery can become its own kind of truth, one that shapes lives long after the event itself. The psychology of this case is not just about the perpetrator, whoever they may be. It's about the investigators, the witnesses, the family, and the millions of strangers who have followed the story. It's about how we process uncertainty, how we assign meaning to incomplete information, and how we live with the possibility that some answers may never come. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. Somewhere, there is a truth about what happened to Madeleine McCann. It may be simple, it may be complex, it may be something no one has yet imagined. But until it is found, the case will remain suspended between fact and speculation, between hope and resignation. Because in the end, the Madeleine McCann disappearance is not just a mystery. It is a mirror reflecting our need for answers, our vulnerability to doubt, and our uneasy relationship with the unknown. And that is why, all these years later, we are still looking. The Black Dahlia, gruesome mutilation, iconic imagery, still unsolved. But this is not a story about the gore in a vacant lot. It's about the psychology of a killer who turned murder into a performance. The mystery of a young woman whose life and death became inseparable from myth, and the cover-up, both intentional and accidental, that has kept the truth buried for nearly 8 decades. In January 1947, Los Angeles was a city of contradictions. Glamour and grit lived side by side. Hollywood promised dreams, but the streets were full of people chasing them and falling short. Elizabeth Short was one of them. An aspiring actress, a drifter between friends' couches, a figure who seemed to hover on the edge of the spotlight without ever stepping fully into it. When her body was found, the brutality was unlike anything the city had seen. But what made the case infamous was not just the violence, it was the way it was staged. The body was posed, drained of blood, displayed as if the killer wanted it to be seen. This is where the psychology begins. In forensic profiling, such staging often signals a need for control, a desire to send a message. The killer wasn't just disposing of a victim, they were creating a tableau. The mystery deepens when we consider the choice of victim. Elizabeth was not a celebrity, yet she was photogenic, striking, and already known in certain circles. By killing her in such a theatrical way, the perpetrator ensured she would become famous in death. This suggests narcissistic exhibitionism. The killer wanted their work to be recognized, even if their name never was. The cover-up began almost immediately, though not in the way you might think. The crime scene was compromised within hours. Photographers, reporters, and curious onlookers trampled through it. Evidence was contaminated, footprints erased, potential clues lost forever. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was chaos, the product of a time before modern forensic protocols. But the effect was the same. The trail grew colder before it had even begun. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. Newspapers splashed Elizabeth's image across front pages, inventing the nickname Black Dahlia to give the story a noir allure. They dug into her past, painting her alternately as an innocent dreamer and a dangerous seductress. This duality, angel or femme fatale, became part of the case's enduring intrigue. It also muddied the investigation, as public perception shifted from finding a killer to dissecting the victim's morality. Psychologically, this is significant. When a victim is portrayed as morally ambiguous, it can unconsciously shift blame away from the perpetrator. It creates space for the idea that the victim's lifestyle somehow invited the crime, a dangerous distortion that can derail justice. In the Black Dahlia case, it may have allowed the killer to hide in plain sight, confident that the narrative was no longer solely about them. Over the years, suspects emerged and faded. Doctors, actors, drifters, even police officers were named. Some confessions were hoaxes, others were delusions. The sheer number of false leads became its own form of cover-up, burying the truth under a mountain of noise. In criminal psychology, this is known as signal-to-noise manipulation. Whether by design or accident, the real clues are drowned out by the irrelevant. One of the most enduring theories points to a killer with medical knowledge, based on the precision of the body's dissection. If true, this would suggest a perpetrator comfortable with anatomy, perhaps even accustomed to death. But here's where the intrigue sharpens. If the killer was indeed a professional, they would also understand how to avoid leaving trace evidence. That level of skill could explain why, despite the brutality, the crime yielded so few usable leads. The Black Dahlia case also reveals the psychological interplay between killer and city. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a place obsessed with image. The killer exploited that, creating a crime that was as much about spectacle as it was about violence. The staging, the choice of victim, the public display, it all played into the city's fascination with beauty, fame, and scandal. In a way, the killer turned the entire city into an unwilling audience. The cover-up, then, is not just about lost evidence or false leads. It's about the way the case became a story, and the story became a legend. Legends are harder to solve than crimes. They attract embellishment, distortion, and endless reinterpretation. Every retelling adds another layer between the facts and the truth. From a psychological standpoint, the killer's greatest success may have been in creating a crime that could never be cleanly resolved. Whether they intended it or not, the combination of spectacle, media frenzy, and investigative missteps ensured that the case would live on in uncertainty. And uncertainty is fertile ground for myth. The mystery that lingers is not just who killed Elizabeth Short, but why they chose to do it in a way that guaranteed attention. Was it personal? Was it a message to someone else? Or was it an act of pure self-expression, the work of someone who saw murder as art? Each possibility points to a different psychological profile, and without definitive evidence, each remains plausible. The Black Dahlia forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that some crimes are designed to be unsolved. They are built to outlast the investigation, to live on in the public imagination long after the evidence has faded. In such cases, the killer doesn't just take a life. They take control of the narrative, shaping how the victim is remembered and how the story is told. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. Elizabeth Short's life has been overshadowed by the manner of her death. The killer ensured that her image, stylized, mysterious, forever frozen in black and white, would become iconic. In doing so, they achieved a kind of immortality, not for themselves, but for the crime. Because in the end, the Black Dahlia is not just an unsolved murder. It is a mirror held up to a city, reflecting its obsessions, its flaws, and its willingness to turn tragedy into spectacle. It is a reminder that sometimes, the most enduring cover-up is not the hiding of evidence, but the transformation of truth into legend. And legends, by their nature, are almost impossible to kill. The Setagaya family murder, killer stayed in the house after the crime, chilling intimacy. But this is not a story about the blood on the floor. It's about the mind that could walk through a family's home, extinguish 4 lives, and then linger, eating their food, using their bathroom, touching their belongings, as if the boundary between killer and victim no longer existed. It's about the mystery of an intruder who left behind more evidence than most criminals ever would, and yet remains a ghost. On the night of December 30th, 2000, in a quiet residential corner of Setagaya, Tokyo, the Miyazawa family's home stood beside a park, its back wall bordering open space. Mikio, Yasuko, and their children Nina and Rei were inside, preparing for the new year. Sometime that night, an unknown man entered, likely through a second-floor window, and began a sequence of events that would leave investigators stunned for decades. The psychology of this case begins with the intimacy of intrusion. Most killers want to get in, commit the act, and get out. Here, the opposite happened. After the murders, the intruder stayed. He ate ice cream from the freezer. He rummaged through drawers. He used the family's computer. He even went to the bathroom and didn't flush. This is not the behavior of someone afraid of being caught. It's the behavior of someone who, for a time, felt ownership over the space. That sense of ownership is deeply unsettling. In criminal psychology, it can indicate a territorial mindset, the idea that once the crime is committed, the scene belongs to the perpetrator. It's a form of dominance, a way of erasing the victim's presence and replacing it with their own. But it can also point to immaturity or impulsivity, the kind of recklessness seen in younger offenders who don't fully grasp the risk they're taking. The mystery deepens when we look at the evidence. The killer left behind fingerprints, DNA, clothing, even fecal matter. He didn't wear gloves. He didn't wipe surfaces. He didn't take the murder weapons with him. In most cases, this would make identification inevitable. And yet, despite having his genetic profile, police have never matched it to anyone in Japan's databases. This suggests one of two things. Either he was a foreign national, or he has never been arrested for a serious crime in Japan. The cover-up here is not a deliberate conspiracy. It's the killer's anonymity, preserved by circumstance. If he was a foreigner, he may have left the country before his DNA could be cross-referenced. If he was a local with no criminal record, he could still be living quietly, his identity hidden in plain sight. The abundance of evidence paradoxically becomes part of the intrigue. How can someone leave so much of themselves behind and still vanish? There's also the question of behavioral contradiction. The killer showed agility and planning in entering the house, cutting through a screen, climbing to a second-floor window. He brought at least one knife with him, suggesting forethought. But once inside, his actions became chaotic. He used one of the family's own knives when his broke. He spilled blood throughout the house. He lingered for hours. This mix of planning and disorganization is rare, and it complicates profiling. Some theories suggest he was young, perhaps a teenager or man in his early 20s at the time. The consumption of ice cream, the casual use of the computer, the lack of cleanup. These could point to someone immature, even impulsive. Others believe the lingering was deliberate, a way to savor the aftermath, to imprint himself on the space. In either case, the psychological profile is one of someone who felt strangely comfortable in the home of the people he had just killed. The location adds another layer of intrigue. The Miyazawa house bordered a park that was slated for redevelopment. The back of the property was exposed to open space, making it easier for someone to approach unseen. Some speculate the killer may have been familiar with the area, perhaps a skateboarder or park-goer who had noticed the family before. If so, this wasn't a random target. It was chosen. The cover-up, in a broader sense, may lie in the sheer ordinariness of the suspect's life outside that night. If he was young, he could have returned to school or work the next day, carrying the memory of what he'd done, but showing no outward sign. If he was a transient or foreign visitor, he could have left Japan entirely, his trail going cold the moment he boarded a plane or train. The psychological intimacy of the crime is what makes it so haunting. Staying in the house after killing its occupants is not just risky, it's personal. It suggests a desire to inhabit their world, if only briefly. To sit where they sat, eat what they ate, touch what they touched. In some cases, this kind of behavior is linked to trophy taking, where the killer wants to keep a piece of the victim's life. Here, the trophy may have been the experience itself. The mystery remains because every clue seems to lead to more questions. The DNA points to someone of mixed East Asian and European ancestry, possibly with connections to a U.S. military base. Sand found on the clothing could be traced to a specific location, but it has not led to an arrest. The killer's clothing was mass-produced, sold in many places. Each detail is tantalizing, but none is definitive. And so the case sits in a strange limbo, overflowing with evidence, yet starved of answers. The police know more about the killer's biology than in most unsolved murders, but they don't know his name. The public knows the broad strokes of the crime, but not the motive. And the house itself still stands, a silent monument to a night when safety was shattered in one of Tokyo's quietest neighborhoods. The Setagaya family murder forces us to confront the limits of investigation when the perpetrator is both careless and lucky. It shows how a killer can leave behind a trail of physical evidence, but still escape justice if the right connection is never made. And it leaves us with the image of a stranger moving through a family's home in the hours after their deaths, opening the fridge, sitting at the computer, leaving his DNA on everything he touched. Perhaps the most chilling thought is this: for those hours, the killer wasn't hiding. He was living there. In his mind, the house was his. And when he finally left, he walked back into the world carrying nothing but the memory of what he'd done, leaving behind a puzzle that, even with all its pieces, refuses to be solved. Because in the end, the Setagaya family murder is not just an unsolved crime. It's an intrusion into the very idea of home, a reminder that the walls we think protect us are only as strong as the secrets they can keep. The Long Island serial killer, bodies found, killer unidentified, modern-day phantom. But this is not a story about the sand dunes or the crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. It's about the mind of someone who could operate in plain sight for years, leaving a trail of bodies along a stretch of beach, and yet remain invisible. It's about the mystery of a predator who understood not just how to kill, but how to vanish into the noise of everyday life. The case began to unfold in 2010, when police searching for a missing woman stumbled upon human remains near Gilgo Beach. That discovery led to more bodies, more questions, and the realization that this was not the work of chance. It was the work of someone deliberate, organized, and patient. The victims, many of them sex workers, had been discarded close to one another, suggesting a comfort with the area and a confidence in returning to it. The psychology here is chilling. This is not the impulsive violence of someone acting in rage. This is organized predation, a pattern where the offender plans the encounter, controls the victim, and disposes of the body in a way that minimizes risk. In such cases, the act itself is often as much about control as it is about killing. The victim is chosen, not stumbled upon. The location is selected, not improvised. Targeting sex workers is a calculated choice. From a criminal psychology standpoint, it reduces the risk of immediate detection. Sex workers are more likely to meet strangers, less likely to have someone know their exact whereabouts, and, tragically, less likely to trigger urgent police action when they go missing. This is not just convenience, it's exploitation of society's blind spots. The mystery deepens when we consider the killer's ability to blend in. Profilers have long suggested that such an offender is likely to be socially competent, able to approach victims without raising alarm, persuasive enough to gain their trust, and careful enough to leave little trace. This is the paradox. The person capable of such brutality may also be capable of appearing utterly ordinary. And yet, the killer didn't remain entirely silent. In at least one case, the victim's family received taunting phone calls. This is a dangerous move for an offender. It risks exposure. But it also reveals something about the psychology at play, the need to extend the control beyond the moment of death. By calling, by speaking, the killer reasserts dominance, turning grief into another arena for manipulation. The cover-up here is not a single act. It's a sustained invisibility. The killer's familiarity with the dumping grounds suggests local knowledge. The choice of a remote, marshy stretch of beach means fewer witnesses, fewer cameras, fewer accidental discoveries. The bodies were close enough to be found together, but far enough from casual foot traffic to remain hidden for years. This is environmental control, using the landscape itself as an accomplice. The investigation has been hampered by the very nature of the crimes. Multiple jurisdictions, overlapping timelines, and the possibility of more than one offender have all complicated the picture. In such cases, the truth can be obscured not by deliberate obstruction, but by the sheer complexity of the puzzle. Each agency holds a piece, but without perfect coordination, the full image remains incomplete. There's also the question of whether all the bodies found belong to the same killer. Some were wrapped in burlap, others were not. Some were dismembered, others intact. This variation could mean multiple offenders, or a single offender whose methods evolved over time. In either case, the uncertainty itself becomes part of the cover-up. If investigators can't be sure which crimes are connected, the trail to the killer becomes harder to follow. From a psychological perspective, the Long Island serial killer, if it is one person, shows traits of both meticulous planning and adaptive flexibility. The planning is evident in the choice of victims, the disposal sites, and the avoidance of detection. The adaptability is seen in the variation of methods, the ability to operate over years without a clear pattern that locks them into a single profile. This combination is rare, and it makes the offender harder to catch. The intrigue is heightened by the proximity of the crimes to everyday life. Gilgo Beach is not a remote wilderness. It's within reach of suburban neighborhoods, highways, and commuter routes. The killer could have been living a completely normal-seeming life, going to work, shopping for groceries, attending family events, all while carrying the knowledge of what lay hidden in the sand. The cover-up may also be personal. If the killer has a family, friends, or colleagues, they may have noticed odd behavior, absences, unexplained injuries, sudden mood changes, but dismissed it. People are reluctant to believe someone they know could be capable of such acts. This is cognitive dissonance at work. When reality conflicts with belief, the mind often chooses the version that feels safer. The mystery endures because the killer has, so far, managed to control the pace of the story. The bodies were found when he, or they, were ready for them to be found, whether by accident or design. The calls, the choice of victims, the disposal sites, all suggest someone who understands not just how to commit murder, but how to manage the narrative around it. And that may be the most dangerous skill of all. In the public imagination, the Long Island serial killer is a shadow, a phantom. But in reality, they are, or were, someone tangible, someone who walks on the same streets as everyone else. The fact that they have remained unidentified for so long is not just a failure of investigation. It's a testament to their ability to hide in plain sight. The psychology of such an offender is built on layers. The outer layer of normalcy, the inner layer of predation, and beneath that, the core of compulsion that drives them to kill again and again. Each layer is a form of camouflage, and each has so far held. The Long Island serial killer case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that some predators are not caught because they are lucky, but because they are skilled. Skilled at reading people, skilled at exploiting weaknesses in individuals, in systems, in the very fabric of the communities they haunt. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: the killer could still be out there, watching the coverage, reading the theories, walking past the very places where their victims were found, secure in the knowledge that, for now, they remain a ghost. Because in the end, the Long Island serial killer is not just a criminal. They are a reminder that in the modern world, even with DNA databases, surveillance cameras, and digital footprints, it is still possible for a human being to become a phantom, seen only in the wake of their violence, and never in the light. The boy in the box, a child's body found in a box, never identified, tragic anonymity. But this is not a story about the bruises or the cardboard. It's about the psychology of a case that haunted a city for decades, the mystery of a life erased before it could be known, and the layers of cover-up, some deliberate, some accidental, that kept his name hidden for more than half a century. In February 1957, on the edge of Philadelphia, a young boy's body was discovered inside a discarded bassinet box. He was between 4 and 6 years old, malnourished, with signs of past medical treatment, scars from surgery, a recent haircut, fingernails neatly trimmed. He had been cleaned, almost groomed, before being left in the cold. It was as if someone wanted to erase the chaos of his last moments and replace it with a strange, unsettling order. The psychology begins here. In many homicide cases, the way a body is left tells a story about the relationship between victim and killer. The grooming, the careful placement, can suggest a conflicted emotional state, remorse intertwined with violence, or a desire to control the narrative even after death. Whoever placed him there didn't simply discard him, they staged him. And staging is rarely random. The mystery deepens when we consider what was missing. No one came forward to claim him. No missing child report matched his description. In a time before DNA databases, investigators relied on fingerprints, dental records, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize his face. But the silence was absolute. This is where the case shifts from tragedy to enigma. How does a child vanish from the world without anyone raising an alarm? One possibility is isolation. The boy may have lived in a closed environment, hidden from neighbors, kept out of school, cut off from extended family. In such cases, the abuser controls not only the victim's life, but also their visibility. This is social erasure, removing a person from the networks that would notice their absence. It's a form of control that extends beyond life, ensuring that even in death, the victim remains invisible. The cover-up here is subtle but devastating. If the boy's caretakers were the ones responsible, they may have relied on the fact that no one outside their immediate circle knew he existed. Without a paper trail, no school enrollment, no medical records beyond what they could conceal, there was nothing for investigators to connect him to. The anonymity was built long before the crime. Over the years, the case became known as America's Unknown Child. Flyers were distributed. His face was reconstructed in sketches and clay models, and the story was told and retold in newspapers and on television. But each retelling carried its own distortions. Some portrayed him as a runaway, others as a victim of organized crime, still others as a child from an institution. The sheer number of theories became its own form of noise, burying the truth under speculation. From a psychological standpoint, the public's obsession with the case speaks to our discomfort with anonymity in death, especially for a child. We want to name the lost, to give them back their identity, because identity is a form of justice. Without it, the crime feels unfinished, the story unresolved. The boy in the box became a symbol of that unresolved grief, a reminder that some stories resist closure. The intrigue also lies in the false leads. Over the decades, people came forward claiming to know who he was, or even to be related to him. Some were hoaxes, others were cases of mistaken identity. Each one consumed investigative resources, and each one ended in disappointment. This is the paradox of high-profile cold cases. The more attention they get, the more they attract misinformation, which can obscure the real path to the truth. One of the most compelling aspects of the case is the contrast between the abundance of physical evidence and the absence of answers. Investigators had the boy's fingerprints, his hair, his clothing, the box he was found in, even the blanket that covered him. They traced the box to a specific store, the blanket to a specific manufacturer. And yet, every lead ended in a dead end. It's as if the killer had anticipated each step and chosen items that could never be traced back to them. This level of foresight suggests a perpetrator who understood investigative methods, someone methodical, perhaps with experience in avoiding detection. But it could also point to luck or to the limitations of forensic science in the 1950s. In either case, the result was the same. The boy remained a mystery. The psychological weight of the case on investigators was immense. Detectives carried his photograph in their wallets for years, hoping that one day they would see a face that matched. Some visited his grave, marked only with the words, "America's Unknown Child." This kind of long-term attachment is not unusual in cases involving children. It reflects the human need to protect, even when protection comes too late. The cover-up, if we can call it that, may have been as simple as silence. If the people who knew him were complicit, they may have chosen to say nothing out of fear, guilt, or self-preservation. In small, closed communities, silence can be as effective as any elaborate deception. And when decades pass, that silence becomes part of the landscape, as immovable as the grave itself. The boy in the box forces us to confront the fragility of identity. In life, we are defined by our connections, family, friends, records, routines. Remove those, and a person can disappear without leaving a trace. In death, without those connections, even the most determined investigation can falter. And yet, the case endures. It endures because it is more than a crime. It is a question. Who was he? Who failed him? And how could a child's life be erased so completely that it took more than 60 years to even give him back his name? The tragedy is not only in the violence he suffered, but in the way the world allowed him to remain nameless for so long. The mystery is in the gap between the evidence we have and the truth we can't reach. And the intrigue is in the possibility that someone, somewhere, still knows the answers and has chosen not to speak. Because in the end, the boy in the box is not just a victim of a crime. He is a victim of erasure, of a cover-up built from silence, and of a society that, for decades, could not see him. And that is why his story still haunts us. It is a reminder that the most chilling crimes are not always the ones we can see, but the ones that hide in the spaces where no one is looking. Andrei Chikatilo, Soviet-era serial killer with dozens of victims, state failure. But this is not a story about the crime scenes scattered across forests and train stations. It's about the psychology of a man who hid monstrous compulsions behind the mask of an unremarkable citizen, the mystery of how he evaded capture for over a decade, and the cover-up, both systemic and cultural, that allowed him to keep killing in a society that claimed such crimes could not exist. Born in 1936 in Soviet Ukraine, Chikatilo's early life was shaped by famine, war, and deprivation. He grew up in an environment where hunger was constant, privacy was non-existent, and fear was woven into daily life. Psychologists later noted that such formative conditions can distort emotional development, especially when combined with humiliation, neglect, and the absence of healthy attachment. Chikatilo's childhood was marked by bedwetting, bullying, and a deep sense of inadequacy. As an adult, he struggled with sexual dysfunction, a fact that became central to his pathology. The psychology here is chilling. Chikatilo's crimes were not impulsive explosions of rage. They were ritualized acts that fused violence with sexual gratification. In forensic terms, this is sexual sadism, deriving pleasure from the suffering of others. But in Chikatilo's case, it was also about reclaiming a sense of power he never felt in his early life. Each attack was a performance in which he controlled every variable: the victim's fear, the pace of the violence, the moment of death. The mystery lies in how he managed to operate for so long without being caught. Between 1978 and 1990, he murdered dozens: children, teenagers, women, often near public transport hubs, luring them with promises of food, money, or help. The Soviet Union's investigative apparatus was vast, but it was also rigid, bureaucratic, and hampered by ideology. Officially, serial murder was considered a Western phenomenon, incompatible with the moral fabric of the socialist state. This denial created a blind spot that Chikatilo exploited. The cover-up was not a single act, but a culture of concealment. Local authorities were under pressure to maintain the image of a crime-free society. Admitting that a serial killer was at large would have been seen as a political failure. As a result, early warnings were downplayed, and investigative leads were sometimes suppressed. In some cases, innocent men were arrested, coerced into confessions, and even executed for crimes Chikatilo had committed. These miscarriages of justice not only destroyed lives, they also bought Chikatilo more time. From a psychological standpoint, the state's denial fed directly into his ability to keep killing. The lack of public warnings meant potential victims were unaware of the danger. The fragmented nature of Soviet policing, where information was siloed between regions, meant patterns were harder to detect. Chikatilo understood this. He traveled widely, choosing victims in different jurisdictions, knowing the dots would be slow to connect. The intrigue also lies in his double life. Outwardly, Chikatilo was a married man, a father, a factory worker, even a schoolteacher for a time. He attended community events, read literature, and appeared, to most, as painfully ordinary. This ordinariness was his camouflage. In criminal profiling, such offenders are sometimes called organized killers. They plan meticulously, blend into their surroundings, and leave minimal forensic evidence. Chikatilo's ability to present as harmless was one of his most dangerous traits. When he was first arrested in 1984 on suspicion of theft, police took blood samples. At the time, forensic testing in the Soviet Union relied on a crude understanding of blood typing and secretor status. Chikatilo's blood type did not match the semen samples from the crime scenes, leading investigators to release him. What they didn't know was that he had a rare genetic condition where his blood type differed between his blood and other bodily fluids. This scientific gap became another layer of the cover-up, an error that allowed him to walk free. The psychological escalation of his crimes is also telling. Early attacks were clumsy, but over time, his methods became more refined, his confidence greater. He began to take more risks: daylight abductions, bolder approaches. This is common in serial offenders. The longer they evade capture, the more invincible they feel. For Chikatilo, each successful murder reinforced the belief that he was beyond the reach of the law. The eventual breakthrough came not from a sudden confession or a lucky tip, but from a shift in investigative strategy. By the late 1980s, the body count was too high to ignore. A centralized task force was formed, and criminal profiling, still a new concept in the Soviet Union, was brought into play. Undercover officers monitored train stations and bus depots, looking for men who fit the behavioral patterns of the killer. In 1990, Chikatilo was spotted behaving suspiciously near a train station, and this time, the net closed. Even then, the intrigue continued. Chikatilo initially denied everything, but after days of interrogation, he began to talk, at length, in detail, almost with pride. His confessions were chilling not just for their content, but for the detachment with which he described the murders. Psychologists noted his lack of remorse, his tendency to rationalize his actions, and his fixation on the humiliation he had suffered in his youth. In his mind, the killings were a way to rewrite his own history, to transform himself from victim to predator. The cover-up's final act was the trial itself. In 1992, Chikatilo was paraded in a metal cage before a packed courtroom. The proceedings were as much theater as justice, part catharsis for a public kept in the dark for years, part demonstration that the state could, after all, protect its citizens. But the truth was more complicated. The state had failed, repeatedly, to stop him. The trial could not erase the fact that dozens had died, because a system built on secrecy and denial could not admit what was happening. From a psychological lens, Chikatilo's story is a convergence of personal pathology and systemic failure. His sadism and compulsion to kill might have emerged in any society, but the Soviet Union structure gave him unique advantages: a lack of public awareness, fragmented policing, and an ideological refusal to acknowledge the existence of someone like him. The mystery of how he evaded capture for so long is inseparable from the political context in which he operated. The intrigue endures because Chikatilo was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was a man who could sit across from you on a train, make small talk, and seem utterly forgettable. His ordinariness was his greatest disguise, and the state's silence was his greatest ally. In the end, the Andrei Chikatilo case is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of a system that could not see him or would not admit he existed until it was too late. It is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always the ones who stand out. They are often the ones who know exactly how to disappear into the crowd and how to use the blind spots of those who should be watching. Because the real horror here is not only in what Chikatilo did, but in how long he was allowed to do it. And that is why his name, and the failures that enabled him, remain etched into history as a warning. When denial becomes policy, the cost is measured in lives. The Highway of Tears, indigenous women missing, ignored for decades. But this is not a story about the roadside memorials or the faded flyers fluttering in the wind. It's about the psychology of systemic neglect, the mystery of how so many lives could vanish along a single stretch of road, and the cover-up, not of evidence, but of empathy, that allowed the disappearances to continue without outrage, without urgency, and without answers. Highway 16 cuts through the heart of British Columbia, Canada. It's a remote, winding corridor that spans over 700 kilometers, bordered by dense forests, isolated communities, and long stretches of silence. Since 1969, dozens of women, most of them indigenous, have gone missing or been found murdered along this route. The exact number is still debated. Some say 40, others say far more. What's not debated is the pattern. Young women, often hitchhiking, often poor, often forgotten. The psychology of this case begins with social invisibility. Indigenous women in Canada have long been marginalized, economically, politically, and culturally. When someone is invisible to the systems meant to protect them, their disappearance doesn't trigger the same alarms. Their absence is not treated as an emergency, but as a statistic. This is not just neglect, it's a form of psychological erasure. Many of the victims were hitchhiking, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Public transportation along the Highway of Tears is sparse or non-existent. For women trying to get to school, work, or medical appointments, hitchhiking was often the only option. The danger was known, the risk was real, but the infrastructure didn't change. The silence around their vulnerability became part of the landscape. The mystery deepens when we ask why. Why did it take decades for the disappearances to be taken seriously? Why were families forced to conduct their own searches, raise their own funds, and beg for media attention? The answer lies in institutional bias, a psychological tendency to devalue the suffering of those outside the dominant social group. When a missing person is indigenous, poor, or involved in sex work, their case is often deprioritized. The assumption is that they were at risk, that their disappearance was somehow expected. This bias isn't always conscious. It's embedded in policy, in media coverage, in the language used by officials. It's in the way some cases are given names, faces, and airtime, while others are reduced to a line in a report. Over time, this creates a hierarchy of grief. Some lives are mourned publicly, others are mourned in silence. The cover-up, then, is not a single act of concealment. It's a pattern of omission. The failure to connect cases, the failure to warn communities, the failure to allocate resources. It's the absence of outrage, the absence of urgency, the absence of justice. From a psychological standpoint, the impact on indigenous communities is profound. Each disappearance is not just a personal loss, it's a communal wound. The trauma is intergenerational. Mothers teach daughters how to stay safe, how to be alert, how to disappear less easily. But the fear remains. The knowledge that safety is not guaranteed, that justice is not promised. The intrigue also lies in the possibility of multiple perpetrators. Some believe the Highway of Tears is the hunting ground of a serial killer. Others believe it's the site of opportunistic violence. Different men, different motives, united only by the vulnerability of their victims. Either way, the road itself becomes symbolic, a place where danger is constant and accountability is rare. Project E-Pana, launched by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was meant to investigate the cases. It began with 18, expanded to 40, and then stalled. Funding was cut. Leads dried up. Families were left waiting. The project's limitations became part of the story, a reminder that even when attention is finally given, it can be fleeting. The psychological toll on families is immeasurable. Many have spoken of the way their grief was met with suspicion. Instead of comfort, they were asked about their daughter's lifestyle, her choices, her past. This is victim blaming, a defense mechanism that shifts responsibility away from the system and onto the individual. It's easier to question the victim than to confront the failures that allowed her to vanish. And yet, the voices of these families have become the most powerful force in the case. They've held vigils, marched, testified, and demanded change. Their persistence has forced the country to look at itself, to confront the racism, the indifference, and the silence that allowed the Highway of Tears to become a graveyard. The mystery remains. Some cases have been solved. Others are still open. Many may never be. But the deeper mystery is not who did it. It's how so many people allowed it to happen. How a nation known for peace and progress could ignore the suffering of its own citizens for so long. The Highway of Tears forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice is not distributed equally, that some lives are protected more fiercely than others, that some disappearances are met with helicopters and headlines, while others are met with shrugs. It also forces us to examine our own psychology. What stories do we pay attention to? What faces do we remember? What assumptions do we make about who deserves help and who doesn't? The answers to those questions shape not just policy, but culture. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the road is still there. The communities are still there. The women are still walking. And the danger has not disappeared. Because in the end, the Highway of Tears is not just a place. It's a symbol of what happens when silence becomes policy, when neglect becomes routine, and when the people most in need of protection are the ones most easily ignored. And that is why the story must be told, not just to solve the mystery, but to ensure that no more names are added to the list, that no more families are left searching, that no more tears fall on a highway that has already seen too many. The Brandon Teena case. Hate crime that inspired Boys Don't Cry, identity under attack. But this is not a story about the bullets or the blood. It's about the psychology of identity in a world that refuses to see it, the mystery of how prejudice can escalate into violence in plain sight, and the cover-up, not of evidence, but of responsibility, that allowed a young life to be destroyed when it could have been saved. Brandon Teena was born Teena Brandon in 1972 in Lincoln, Nebraska. From a young age, Brandon rejected the gender assigned at birth, crafting a male identity long before the language of transgender was widely understood or accepted. In a conservative, rural environment, this self-definition was both an act of courage and a constant risk. Brandon's life was a balancing act, living authentically while navigating a society that saw his identity as deception. The psychology here is layered. Brandon's self-presentation was not a disguise in the criminal sense. It was an assertion of truth in the face of a culture that denied it. But to those around him, especially in the early 1990s Midwest, it was seen as a challenge to rigid gender norms. In social psychology, this is identity threat, when someone's existence undermines the perceived stability of a social order, triggering defensiveness, hostility, and, in extreme cases, violence. When Brandon moved to the small town of Falls City, Nebraska, he quickly integrated into a circle of friends, dating a young woman named Lana Tisdall. To many, he was charming, respectful, and attentive. But when his assigned sex was revealed, through gossip, legal trouble, and the prying of those who felt entitled to expose him, the reaction was swift and brutal. Two men in his social circle, John Lauder and Tom Neeson, responded not with conversation or distance, but with rage. The mystery is not in what happened next. It is in why it was allowed to happen at all. In December 1993, Lauder and Neeson assaulted and raped Brandon, an act meant not only to harm but to punish, to reassert their dominance over someone they saw as violating the rules of gender and sexuality. Brandon went to the police, gave a detailed statement, and named his attackers. This should have been the turning point, the moment when the system intervened. Instead, the cover-up began, not in the form of shredded documents or hidden evidence, but in the way the sheriff's office handled the case. Brandon was subjected to invasive, humiliating questions about his body and his relationships. The focus shifted from the crime committed against him to his identity, as if being transgender somehow made him less of a victim. This is institutional bias in its rawest form. The reflex to see certain people as less deserving of protection, less credible, less human. The psychological impact of such treatment is devastating. Survivors of violence often rely on law enforcement for safety and validation. When that trust is broken, it compounds the trauma. Brandon, already vulnerable, was left exposed. His attackers were not arrested immediately. They knew he had gone to the police, and they knew nothing had happened to stop them. A week later, on December 31st, 1993, Lauder and Neeson tracked Brandon to the home of Lisa Lambert, where he was staying. They murdered him, along with Lambert and another friend, Philip Devine. The killings were not random. They were the final act in a chain of escalating violence that had been visible to anyone paying attention. The intrigue lies in the intersection of personal prejudice and systemic failure. Lauder and Neeson acted out of hatred, but their ability to act without consequence was enabled by the sheriff's inaction. This is where the cover-up becomes more than neglect. It becomes complicity. By failing to arrest the men after the assault, by treating Brandon as a suspect rather than a victim, the system signaled that his life was not worth protecting. From a psychological standpoint, the case is a study in dehumanization. When a person is stripped of their identity in the eyes of others, when they are reduced to a label, a stereotype, or a problem, it becomes easier for violence to be rationalized. Lauder and Neeson did not see Brandon as a man, or even as a person with equal rights. They saw him as an affront to their worldview, and in their minds, that justified anything. The mystery that lingers is how many points of intervention were missed. Friends knew tensions were high. Police knew Brandon was in danger. The threats were not hidden, they were spoken aloud. And yet, no one stopped the trajectory toward murder. This is the psychology of bystander inaction. The assumption that someone else will step in, or that the danger is not as imminent as it seems. In Brandon's case, that assumption was fatal. The aftermath brought national attention, especially after the release of the film Boys Don't Cry. But even in the retelling, there is a tension between truth and narrative. The movie brought empathy to millions who had never heard of Brandon, but it also simplified the complexity of his life, his identity, and the systemic failures that led to his death. The real story is not just about one act of violence. It's about the environment that made it possible. The cover-up, in the broadest sense, is the way society has historically erased the realities of transgender lives. In the early 1990s, there was little public understanding of gender identity beyond rigid binaries. Brandon's murder was framed by some as a love triangle gone wrong, rather than a hate crime. This reframing diluted the truth, making it easier for the public to avoid confronting the deeper issues of prejudice and systemic neglect. The psychology of identity under attack is not just about the individual, it's about the community. When one person is targeted for who they are, it sends a message to everyone like them. You are not safe here. Brandon's death became a rallying point for LGBTQ+ activism, a symbol of the urgent need for legal protections, cultural change, and accountability. And yet, the mystery remains in the silences, in the unanswered questions about what might have happened if the sheriff had acted differently, if the community had rallied around Brandon instead of isolating him, if the law had recognized the danger of hate-motivated violence sooner. The Brandon Teena case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that violence against marginalized people is rarely just the act of an individual. It is the product of a chain, personal prejudice, cultural bias, institutional failure, all linking together until the outcome feels inevitable. But inevitability is an illusion. At every link, there was a chance to break the chain. Because in the end, Brandon's story is not just about a murder in a small Nebraska town. It's about the cost of denying someone's identity, the danger of systems that protect the powerful over the vulnerable, and the way silence can be as deadly as a weapon. It's a reminder that the most effective cover-up is not the hiding of facts. It's the refusal to see the truth staring back at you. The Hart family crash, murder-suicide disguised as accident, social media deception. But this is not a story about the twisted wreckage at the bottom of a cliff. It's about the psychology of image-making, the mystery of how a carefully curated life can hide years of abuse, and the cover-up, not in shredded documents or erased files, but in the smiling photographs and inspirational captions that convinced the world everything was perfect. Jennifer and Sarah Hart were, to the outside world, the embodiment of progressive, loving parenthood. A white, married lesbian couple raising 6 black children they had adopted from foster care. Their Facebook pages were filled with road trips, matching outfits, and moments of apparent joy. They attended music festivals, protests, and community events. They were the kind of family strangers pointed to as proof that love could overcome anything. But behind the lens, the reality was starkly different. The psychology of this case begins with impression management, the deliberate crafting of a public identity that conceals the truth. Jennifer, in particular, was the architect of the family's online persona. Every post was polished, every image chosen to reinforce the narrative of a happy, unconventional family thriving against the odds. In social psychology, this is a form of self-presentation bias, showing only what supports the story you want others to believe, while hiding anything that contradicts it. The mystery is how such a facade could hold for so long. There were warning signs. Neighbors reported that the children were underfed, that they came to their house begging for food. Teachers noticed bruises. Social workers received complaints. And yet, time and again, the family slipped through the cracks. Part of the answer lies in confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in a way that confirms existing beliefs. To many, the Harts were rescuers, white saviors who had taken in children from difficult backgrounds. That narrative was so powerful that it overshadowed the possibility they could be harming them. The cover-up was not just the Harts' doing, it was systemic. Child welfare agencies in multiple states had investigated them, but the cases were closed without decisive action. Friends and acquaintances, even when they sensed something was wrong, hesitated to speak out forcefully. Some feared being seen as judgmental or prejudiced against a same-sex couple. Others simply couldn't reconcile the smiling family in the photos with the idea of abuse. This is where cognitive dissonance comes into play. The discomfort of holding two conflicting ideas, resolved by rejecting the one that feels harder to accept. The intrigue deepens when we look at the final days. In March 2018, Child Protective Services attempted to contact the family after new reports of neglect. A social worker arrived at their home, but no one answered the door. The next day, the Harts were gone. Days later, their SUV was found at the bottom of a cliff in Mendocino County, California. At first, it was called a tragic accident, but the investigation revealed chilling details. Jennifer was drunk. Several of the children had high levels of sedatives in their systems. The vehicle had accelerated off the cliff without braking. From a psychological perspective, this was not a spontaneous act, it was a final performance. If the abuse was about control, the crash was about ultimate control, deciding not only how the story ended, but ensuring that no one else could tell it differently. In the minds of some perpetrators of family annihilation, there is a belief that death is preferable to the loss of the image they've built. The shame of exposure, the collapse of the facade, becomes unbearable. The social media deception played a crucial role in enabling this outcome. By projecting an image of perfection, the Harts insulated themselves from scrutiny. Friends saw the posts and assumed all was well. Agencies saw a family that appeared engaged and loving. The curated narrative acted as a shield, deflecting suspicion and buying time. In this way, the cover-up was hiding in plain sight. Every happy family photo another layer of camouflage. The mystery that lingers is whether anyone could have broken through that shield in time. Could a more skeptical eye on their public image have prompted deeper investigation? Could a stronger response to earlier abuse reports have saved the children? These questions are unanswerable now, but they point to a larger truth. When we accept the version of reality people present online without question, we risk missing the truth entirely. The Hart family crash forces us to confront the uncomfortable intersection of perception and reality. It shows how easily a narrative can be constructed, how willingly people will believe it if it aligns with their ideals, and how dangerous that belief can be when it blinds us to warning signs. It also reveals the psychological toll of living a double life, not just on the victims, but on the perpetrators, whose need to maintain control can escalate to catastrophic ends. In the end, the Hart story is not just about a murder-suicide. It's about the power of image, the seduction of a perfect story, and the way social media can be used not just to connect, but to conceal. It's about how systems meant to protect the vulnerable can be disarmed by a well-crafted facade. And it's about the haunting truth that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told with a smile. Because the real deception wasn't in the final act. It was in the years of curated moments that made it possible. And that is why the Hart family crash remains one of the most chilling reminders that what we see is not always what is. The Yuba County five men vanish under bizarre circumstances, a psychological puzzle. But this is not a story about the snow-covered roads or the skeletal remains found months later. It's about the human mind under stress, the mystery of choices that defy logic, and the cover-up, not of evidence, but of understanding, that has kept this case unsolved for nearly half a century. On the night of February 24, 1978, 5 friends from Yuba County, California, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, drove to Chico to watch a college basketball game. They were close-knit, bonded through a local program for adults with mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions. Each had their quirks, their routines, and their comforts. They were not drifters. They were not reckless. They were men whose families described them as dependable, even predictable. After the game, they stopped at a convenience store for snacks, then began the drive home. But they never arrived. Days later, Madruga's prized Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a remote mountain road in the Plumas National Forest, 70 miles off their expected route. The car was in working order, not stuck beyond recovery, and had enough fuel to turn back. Yet it sat there, empty, as if simply left behind. The psychology of this case begins with that decision. Why leave a functioning vehicle in the middle of the night, in freezing conditions, miles from anywhere familiar? For most people, the car is safety, shelter, warmth, a way out. Abandoning it suggests either a belief that something better lay ahead, or a fear that staying put was more dangerous. This is where the mystery deepens. The men were not experienced outdoorsmen. They had no extra clothing, no camping gear. And yet, evidence suggests they walked for miles into the snowbound wilderness. 3 of them, Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt, were later found together, their remains scattered by animals. Weiher was discovered in a locked Forest Service trailer 20 miles from the car. He had survived for weeks, maybe months, before dying of starvation and hypothermia, despite the trailer containing food, fuel, and blankets. Mathias, the 5th man, was never found. The cover-up here is not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It's the way the narrative has been obscured by assumptions. Early speculation painted the men as lost, confused, or acting irrationally because of their disabilities. But this oversimplifies the psychology at play. People with intellectual or psychiatric conditions are not inherently incapable of survival decisions. In fact, their families insisted they were cautious, especially about breaking rules or venturing into unknown places. So why were they there? One theory is that they were misled, either by someone they trusted or by a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. Witnesses reported seeing them in the area that night, possibly with another person. A man stranded nearby with car trouble claimed the group ignored his calls for help, which is odd given their generally helpful nature. This raises the possibility that they were following instructions from someone else, or avoiding contact for reasons we can only guess at. From a psychological standpoint, group dynamics are key. In small, tight-knit groups, decisions are often made collectively, or by deferring to the most assertive member. If one person insisted they should keep moving, the others might have followed, even against their instincts. This is group conformity under stress, the tendency to align with the perceived leader when uncertainty and danger are high. The intrigue intensifies with Weiher's final days. In the trailer, investigators found open cans of food, but much more remained untouched. There were matches, books, and fuel that could have been used for heat, yet Weiher died in the cold. His shoes were missing, replaced by Matthias's sneakers, suggesting Matthias had been there and left. Why didn't they use the resources? Was it ignorance of how to operate the stove, or a fear of damaging government property? Weiher was known to be rule-abiding to a fault, perhaps so much so that he avoided using equipment he didn't think was his to touch. Matthias's absence is the most enduring mystery. He had a history of psychiatric illness, but was managing it well at the time. If he survived longer than the others, did he leave to get help? Did he meet with an accident? Or did something else happen? Something that explains why his body was never found? His disappearance leaves a gap in the narrative that no theory can fully close. The cover-up, in a broader sense, is the way the case has been framed over the years. The focus on the men's disabilities has often overshadowed the more unsettling possibilities, that they were lured, chased, or coerced into the mountains, that they encountered someone whose intentions were not benign, that the events of that night were not random at all. By attributing their fate to confusion or poor judgment, the deeper questions are left unexplored. The psychology of survival also plays a role. In extreme cold, decision-making can deteriorate rapidly. Hypothermia can cause disorientation, irrational behavior, even paradoxical undressing. But the distances involved here, 20 miles on foot in deep snow, suggest determination, not random wandering. They were going somewhere. The question is, where and why? The Yuba County 5 case forces us to confront the limits of our understanding when behavior doesn't match our expectations. It challenges the assumption that all mysteries can be solved by logic alone. Human psychology is not always linear. Fear, trust, loyalty, and perception can combine in ways that lead to choices outsiders can't easily decode. And perhaps that is why the case endures. It's not just about 5 men who vanished. It's about the gap between what we think we know about people and what they might actually do under pressure. It's about the possibility that the truth lies not in a single dramatic event, but in a chain of small decisions, each one understandable in the moment, that together led to disaster. Because in the end, the Yuba County 5 is not just an unsolved mystery. It's a psychological puzzle with missing pieces, pieces that may still be out there, buried in snow, hidden in memory, or lost forever in the mind of the one man who walked away and never came back. Malcom Webster, married, poisoned, and killed for insurance. Chilling manipulation. But this is not a story about the flames of a staged car crash or the toxic traces in a victim's body. It's about the psychology of a man who weaponized trust, the mystery of how he evaded suspicion for years, and the cover-up, not in hidden files or erased evidence, but in the charm, lies, and carefully constructed persona that convinced almost everyone he met that he was incapable of harm. Webster was, on the surface, the perfect gentleman. A trained nurse, polite, attentive, and quick with a sympathetic smile. He had a knack for making people feel seen, valued, and safe. But beneath that exterior was a calculating predator who saw relationships not as connections, but as opportunities, each one a potential payday. His victims were not chosen at random. They were selected for their perceived vulnerability, their financial stability, and their willingness to trust. The psychology here is rooted in coercive persuasion. Webster didn't just lie. He built entire worlds around his lies. He feigned illnesses, including cancer, to elicit sympathy. He positioned himself as the devoted partner, the caring husband, the man who would never hurt anyone. This wasn't improvisation, it was a long game. Every gesture, every word, was part of a script designed to make his eventual betrayal seem unthinkable. The first act of that script played out in Scotland in the early 1990s. Webster married Claire Morris, a vibrant young woman who believed she had found her soulmate. What she didn't know was that he had already taken out multiple life insurance policies in her name. He began drugging her with sedatives, slowly eroding her ability to function, all while presenting himself as the concerned spouse. When the time came, he staged a car crash, drugging her, driving off the road, and setting the vehicle alight. To bystanders, it looked like a tragic accident. To Webster, it was the perfect crime. The mystery is how he got away with it. At the time, investigators accepted his account. The crash was filed as an accident, and Webster collected the insurance payout. This is where the cover-up begins, not in deliberate obstruction by authorities, but in the way his cultivated image shielded him from suspicion. He was the grieving widower, the man who had lost the love of his life. No one wanted to believe otherwise. Years later, in New Zealand, the pattern repeated. His second wife, Felicity Drum, began experiencing unexplained illnesses. Webster had once again secured life insurance policies and was laying the groundwork for another staged crash. But this time, Felicity survived. She began to piece together the inconsistencies, the unexplained medications, the near misses on the road, the financial irregularities. Her suspicions would eventually become the thread that unraveled his carefully woven web. From a psychological standpoint, Webster's behavior fits the profile of a narcissistic and antisocial personality blend. He lacked empathy, viewing people as tools to be used and discarded. His charm was not genuine warmth, but a calculated tactic. He thrived on control over the narrative, over his partner's perceptions, over the pace at which his plans unfolded. The intrigue deepens when we consider how close he came to a third victim. Living in Scotland again, Webster began courting another woman, once more setting the stage for financial gain. By then, however, his past was catching up with him. Detectives, revisiting Claire Morris's death, began to see the pattern. What had once seemed like isolated tragedies now looked like a series of calculated attempts at murder. The cover-up, in its most insidious form, was Webster himself. He was the mask. His victims, their families, even some investigators were drawn in by his apparent sincerity. He knew how to mirror emotions, how to say exactly what someone needed to hear. This is a hallmark of psychopathic manipulation, the ability to mimic empathy without feeling it, to study human behavior and use it as a tool. When the case finally went to trial, it became one of the longest in Scottish history. The prosecution laid out the pattern, the insurance policies, the drugging, the staged crashes. Witnesses described his charm, his lies, his calculated deceit. A forensic psychologist diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder, while a profiler labeled him a sociopath. The jury saw through the mask, convicting him of murder, attempted murder, and fraud. But even in court, Webster's demeanor was telling. He showed little emotion, no visible remorse. For someone like him, the trial was not just a reckoning. It was another stage, another audience. The difference was that this time, the performance failed. The mystery that lingers is how many others he might have targeted, how many close calls went unnoticed. His career as a nurse, his time abroad, his history of relationships, all are shadows where the truth may never fully emerge. And that is part of the enduring intrigue, the possibility that what we know is only a fraction of what he did. The Malcom Webster case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can be polite, well-dressed, and smiling. It shows how easily perception can be manipulated, how systems can fail when they rely too heavily on appearances, and how a skilled deceiver can turn charm into a weapon. Because in the end, Webster's most dangerous tool wasn't the poison or the staged crashes. It was the story he told about himself, the one everyone wanted to believe. And that is why his crimes remain a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest cover-up is not in hiding the evidence, but in making sure no one ever thinks to look. Paulette Gebara Farah case. Found dead in her own bed, suspicious cover-up. But this is not a story about the physical evidence or the forensics alone. It's about the psychology of perception, the mystery of contradictions, and the kind of cover-up that doesn't just hide facts. It distorts the very narrative of reality. In March 2010, Paulette was a 4-year-old girl living with her family in an affluent apartment complex in Interlomas, Mexico. She had been born prematurely, with motor and speech delays, but she was bright, determined, and known for her independence. She could walk short distances with assistance, speak a few words, and was deeply loved by those who knew her. Her parents, Mauricio and Lizette, were financially secure, with a comfortable home and 2 long-term nannies who helped care for the children. On the night of March 21st, Paulette was put to bed as usual. The next morning, she was gone. The apartment's security system showed no sign of forced entry, no record of anyone coming or going. This was the first psychological fracture in the case. How could a child with limited mobility vanish from a locked, secure home without anyone noticing? The disappearance triggered a massive search. Police, volunteers, dogs, helicopters, every resource was mobilized. The media descended, turning the case into a national obsession. Paulette's parents gave emotional interviews, pleading for her safe return. The image was clear, a grieving family desperate for answers. But beneath that image, inconsistencies began to surface. From a psychological standpoint, public appeals are often revealing. In genuine cases of loss, the emotional tone tends to be raw, unfiltered. Here, observers noted moments that felt rehearsed, statements that didn't align with earlier accounts. The human mind is wired to detect incongruence. When words and emotions don't match, suspicion grows. 10 days later, the case took a turn that defied belief. Paulette's body was found in her own bed, wedged between the mattress and the bed frame, covered by her blanket. This was the same bed that had been searched repeatedly by family, police, and even media crews filming inside the room. The discovery shattered the official narrative. How could a child's body remain hidden in plain sight for over a week in a place that had been examined countless times? This is where the cover-up theory takes root. One possibility is that the body was there all along, overlooked due to incompetence. Another is that it was placed there later, after the search had already begun, to create the illusion of an accident. Both scenarios are damning, either a catastrophic investigative failure or a deliberate manipulation of the scene. The mystery deepens when we examine the conflicting statements from those closest to Paulette. Timelines shifted. Details changed. The nanny's accounts didn't always align with the parents'. In high-profile cases, such contradictions can be the result of stress, confusion, or fear, but they can also signal coordinated obfuscation. In psychology, this is known as narrative control, shaping the story to fit a desired outcome, even if it means altering facts. The official ruling eventually labeled Paulette's death an accident, suggesting she had suffocated after becoming trapped in her bed. But this conclusion left more questions than answers. How could no one have heard her? Why did trained search teams fail to find her? And why did the investigation seem to avoid pressing too hard on the family's inconsistencies? Here, we see the interplay between public image and institutional behavior. The family was wealthy, socially connected, and media savvy. In cases like this, there can be subtle pressures, political, social, even economic, that influence how aggressively authorities pursue certain lines of inquiry. This is not always a conscious conspiracy. Sometimes it's the quiet, unspoken bias that bends the course of an investigation. The psychological intrigue lies in the way the case unfolded in the public eye. The media coverage was relentless, but it also became a stage. Every interview, every press conference, every televised walkthrough of the apartment was part of a performance, whether intentional or not. In such an environment, truth becomes harder to separate from presentation. For the public, the discovery of Paulette's body in her own bed was a cognitive shock. It violated the basic expectation that a search, especially one so thorough, would find what was there to be found. This dissonance fuels conspiracy theories because the mind seeks resolution. When the official explanation feels insufficient, alternative narratives rush in to fill the void. From a behavioral perspective, the case also highlights the phenomenon of selective attention. Investigators, like all humans, can become fixated on certain hypotheses, overlooking evidence that doesn't fit. If the initial assumption was abduction, the search may have been unconsciously biased toward looking outside the home, even when the answer was inside it. The cover-up, if it existed, may not have been a single, orchestrated act. It could have been a series of small decisions. What to release to the media, which questions to ask, which leads to follow, that collectively steered the case away from uncomfortable truths. In this way, the most effective cover-ups are often not about hiding evidence, but about shaping perception until the public accepts a version of events that leaves the deeper questions unanswered. The Paulette Gebara Farah case remains one of Mexico's most haunting mysteries because it sits at the intersection of tragedy, suspicion, and image. It forces us to confront how easily narratives can be constructed, how authority can falter under pressure, and how the truth can be obscured not just by lies, but by the absence of clear, consistent answers. In the end, the most unsettling aspect is not just that a child died under suspicious circumstances, It's that the place where she was found should have been the safest place in the world, her own bed. And yet, even there, the truth remains hidden beneath layers of contradiction, unanswered questions, and the lingering sense that what we were told is not the whole story. Because sometimes, the real cover-up isn't about concealing what happened. It's about making sure we never agree on what happened at all. Françoise Michaux murder, brutally killed in her secluded home, quiet horror. But this is not a story about the blood on the floor or the forensic photographs. It's about the psychology of betrayal, the mystery of a crime that unfolded behind closed doors, and the cover-up, not in shredded documents or erased footage, but in the silences, the omissions, and the carefully managed appearances that kept the truth obscured for years. In October 2013, Françoise Michaux was a 72-year-old woman living in the small Belgian village of Royston. Her home was tucked away, private, the kind of place where life moved slowly and neighbors knew each other's routines. She was described as independent, meticulous, and deeply rooted in her community. But isolation, while peaceful, can also be dangerous. It creates the perfect stage for a crime that no one sees coming. The psychology of this case begins with proximity. Most murders of the elderly are not random acts of violence. They are committed by someone the victim knows. Trust becomes the weapon. In Françoise's case, suspicion quickly fell not on a stranger, but on people within her own circle. People who had access to her home, her schedule, and her confidence. This is where the horror deepens. The idea that the danger wasn't outside her door, but already inside her life. The investigation revealed a tangled web of relationships. Among those questioned were her own relatives and their partners. This is where familial betrayal psychology comes into play. Crimes within families often carry motives that are both practical and emotional. Money, inheritance, resentment, or long-standing grievances. But they also carry a layer of intimacy that makes the deception more chilling. To harm someone you've shared meals with, celebrated holidays with, requires a capacity for compartmentalization that most people cannot fathom. The mystery intensified when two people close to Françoise, her stepdaughter-in-law and the stepdaughter-in-law's ex-partner, were charged. The alleged involvement of multiple individuals suggests a conspiracy, and conspiracies require coordination. In psychology, this is shared culpability, when two or more people reinforce each other's justifications for wrongdoing, making it easier to cross moral lines. Alone, one might hesitate. Together, they convince each other it's possible, even necessary. But the most intriguing element is the cover-up. Françoise's murder was not solved overnight. For years, one of the suspects managed to evade justice entirely, living under the radar, even becoming one of Belgium's most wanted fugitives. This ability to disappear speaks to a certain psychological adaptability, knowing how to blend in, how to avoid patterns that draw attention, how to live in a way that leaves no obvious trail. It also points to systemic gaps, the spaces between jurisdictions, the delays in cross-border cooperation, the bureaucratic blind spots that can be exploited by someone determined to stay hidden. The cover-up wasn't just about physical absence. It was also about narrative control. In the early stages, those implicated could present themselves as shocked, grieving, cooperative. They could frame their relationship with Françoise in ways that deflected suspicion. This is a form of impression management, shaping how others perceive you to protect yourself from scrutiny. It's not just lying. It's curating your behavior so that the lie feels plausible. The intrigue also lies in the setting. Royston is not a place where violent crime is common. In small communities, the shock of such an act can create a kind of collective denial. People don't want to believe that someone they know could be capable of murder. This reluctance to suspect those close to home can slow investigations, giving perpetrators more time to cover their tracks. From a psychological perspective, the long delay in bringing all suspects to justice may have emboldened them. When months turn into years without arrest, offenders can start to believe they've outsmarted the system. This belief can lead to riskier behavior, which in turn can create the cracks investigators need to finally close in. In this case, it took years before the fugitive was tracked down in another country, living quietly, as if the past had been buried for good. The mystery that lingers is motive. While financial gain is often the simplest explanation in cases involving older victims, it rarely tells the whole story. Money can be the trigger, but underlying tensions, resentment, perceived slights, family politics, often fuel the willingness to act. In crimes like this, the psychology is layered, greed wrapped in grievance, rationalization wrapped in denial. The cover-up's endurance also raises questions about complicity beyond the main suspects. Did others suspect the truth but choose silence? In close-knit communities, loyalty and fear can intertwine. Speaking out might mean alienating yourself from family or neighbors, or even putting yourself at risk. Silence becomes a form of self-preservation, even if it means justice is delayed. The Françoise Michaux murder forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we've already let into our lives. It shows how trust can be weaponized, how appearances can be manipulated, and how systems can be outmaneuvered by those willing to exploit their weaknesses. And perhaps the most haunting part is the quietness of it all. There was no public spectacle at the time of the crime, no immediate outcry that led to swift arrests. The horror unfolded in private, and the truth emerged slowly, piece by piece, over years. That slow reveal is its own kind of cruelty, forcing those who cared for Françoise to live in uncertainty, to wonder who among them knew more than they were saying. Because in the end, this is not just a story about a murder in a secluded home. It's a story about the psychology of betrayal, the endurance of deception, and the way a crime can echo through a community long after the headlines fade. It's about how the quietest horrors are often the hardest to see and the hardest to forget. Audrey and Eric Hingston case, elderly couple murdered in bed, suburban nightmare. But this is not a story about the knife's edge or the bloodstains on the sheets. It's about the psychology of deception, the mystery of a crime that unfolded behind the facade of a quiet marriage, and the cover-up, not in hidden files or erased footage, but in the calculated performance of innocence that fooled almost everyone, at least for a while. In August 2003, in the quiet suburb of Plimpton, Devon, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was found dead in his bed. His wife, Audrey, then 81, told police a chilling story. Intruders had broken into their home during the night, and Eric, frail and unwell, had been stabbed while trying to confront them. She described the supposed burglars in detail, even naming 2 local men she claimed to have seen in the area. It was a narrative that fit the fears of any suburban community: random violence, faceless danger, the idea that no home is truly safe. The psychology of this case begins with impression management. Audrey understood the power of image. To neighbors, she was the neat, polite, elderly woman who doted on her husband. To the media, she became the grieving widow, her voice trembling as she appealed for information. She played the role so convincingly that her performance was broadcast across the country. This is the first layer of intrigue, the ability to inhabit a persona so completely that it disarms suspicion. But behind the public mask, the truth was far darker. Investigators soon began to notice inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry. The supposed burglars had taken nothing, and the wounds on Eric's body suggested an attack from close range, not the chaotic violence of a home invasion. The story Audrey told was beginning to fray. From a psychological standpoint, her actions fit the profile of instrumental violence, violence committed not in the heat of passion, but as a means to an end. Eric had been in poor health, increasingly dependent on her care. For some, caregiving is an act of love. For others, it becomes a source of resentment, a daily reminder of lost freedom. In Audrey's case, prosecutors argued that she had grown fed up with the burden and decided to end it on her own terms. The cover-up was meticulous in its simplicity. By staging the scene as a burglary, Audrey tapped into a ready-made narrative that required little imagination from the public. People fear strangers breaking in. They don't want to believe that harm could come from within the home. This is narrative exploitation, crafting a story that aligns so neatly with existing fears that it bypasses critical scrutiny. The mystery deepens when we consider her choice to publicly accuse 2 innocent men. This wasn't just deflection. It was an active attempt to redirect the investigation. Psychologically, this shows a willingness to sacrifice others to protect herself, a trait often associated with high levels of self-interest and low empathy. It also reveals confidence, perhaps even arrogance, in her ability to control the narrative. For weeks, Audrey maintained her story. She appeared at press conferences, her demeanor calm, her words carefully chosen. But detectives were quietly dismantling her account. Forensic evidence didn't match her version of events. Witness timelines contradicted her claims. And when confronted, her explanations shifted, small details changing in ways that suggested improvisation rather than truth. The turning point came when investigators concluded that the burglary had been staged. The supposed point of entry was implausible. Items that should have been disturbed were untouched. The scene was too neat, too controlled. In criminal psychology, this is a common flaw in staged crimes. Real chaos is messy, unpredictable, and hard to choreograph. Staging often reveals itself in the very perfection the perpetrator thinks will make it convincing. When Audrey was finally arrested, the shock was profound. The image of the frail, grieving widow collapsed, replaced by the reality of a woman accused of killing her husband in cold blood. In court, she denied murder but pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The court accepted that her mental state had been impaired, and she was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. Here, the cover-up takes on another dimension, not just the one Audrey created, but the one shaped by the justice system's response. Many in the community, and even members of Eric's family, felt the sentence was far too lenient. The idea that a life could be taken in such circumstances and result in such a short prison term left lingering resentment and a sense that justice had only been partially served. From a psychological perspective, Audrey's case is a study in dual identity. To the outside world, she was the devoted wife. In private, she was capable of calculated violence. Maintaining such a duality requires compartmentalization, the ability to separate one's actions from one's self-image, to justify or minimize them internally while projecting an entirely different persona externally. The intrigue also lies in the fact that, even after her conviction, Audrey reportedly showed little remorse. Detectives described her as two-faced and sneaky, someone who could present as harmless while concealing a capacity for manipulation. This lack of visible regret is telling. In forensic psychology, it can indicate a personality structure in which self-preservation outweighs moral reckoning. The suburban setting adds another layer to the story. Crimes in such environments often carry an extra shock factor because they violate the illusion of safety. In a close-knit community, the idea that an elderly couple could be at the center of such violence, especially violence from within, forces people to question their assumptions about the people around them. The Audrey and Eric Hingston case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior. It shows how easily appearances can be crafted and maintained, how narratives can be manipulated to exploit public fears, and how even the most ordinary-seeming lies can conceal extraordinary darkness. And perhaps the most haunting part is the quietness of it all. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public unraveling in the moment. The crime was committed in the stillness of a bedroom. The cover-up played out in the calm tones of a press conference. And the truth emerged only through the slow, methodical work of investigators who refused to accept the story they were being told. Because in the end, this is not just a story about an elderly couple in a quiet suburb. It's a story about the masks people wear, the lies they tell, and the way danger can live right beside you, smiling politely, waiting for the moment when no one is watching. Murder by clown, killer disguised as clown, childhood joy turned grotesque. But this is not a story about the weapon or the wound. It's about the psychology of masks, the mystery of a smiling face hiding lethal intent, and the cover-up, not in shredded files or erased footage, but in the way a costume can distort perception, making the impossible seem harmless until it's too late. It was a sunny morning in a quiet Florida neighborhood in 1990 when the doorbell rang at Marlene Warren's home. She was a businesswoman, a mother, someone whose life was rooted in routine and community. When she opened the door, she was met not by a neighbor or delivery driver, but by a clown. Full makeup, bright orange wig, balloons in one hand, flowers in the other. The image was absurd, almost whimsical, and that was the point. The psychology here begins with symbolic trust. Clowns are cultural shorthand for innocence, for childhood laughter, for harmless fun. They are allowed into spaces where strangers might otherwise be met with suspicion. The costume is a social key. It bypasses the brain's threat detection because it's associated with entertainment, not danger. The killer understood this. They knew that the first few seconds of any encounter are critical, and that a clown's painted smile could buy them those seconds. The mystery deepens when we consider the choice of disguise. This wasn't just concealment, it was theater. The killer didn't want to be invisible. They wanted to be unforgettable. The clown costume guaranteed that the story would burn itself into memory, that it would dominate headlines, that it would live in the minds of everyone who heard it. This is narrative imprinting, committing an act in such a way that the imagery becomes inseparable from the crime. From a psychological standpoint, this is a form of dominance. The killer didn't just take a life. They took control of how that life's final moments would be remembered. They ensured that every retelling would begin with the same surreal image, a clown at the door, balloons in hand, smile painted on. The cover-up began in the very absurdity of the act. A clown committing murder sounds like urban legend, like something too strange to be real. That strangeness can work in the killer's favor. It creates a fog of disbelief, making it harder for witnesses to process what they saw, harder for investigators to separate fact from the distortions of memory under shock. Witnesses remembered the balloons, the flowers, the wig, but the face beneath the makeup, the voice, the gait, those details were blurred by the costume's distraction. This is perceptual misdirection, drawing attention to certain elements so that others go unnoticed. Magicians use it to create illusions. Criminals can use it to obscure identity. And in this case, the disguise was so effective that the killer could shed it minutes later and become just another face in the crowd. For years, the case went cold. The image of the killer was burned into the public consciousness, but the person behind it remained hidden. Rumors swirled about jealousy, about affairs, about financial disputes, but without hard evidence, they remained whispers. The clown became a phantom, a symbol of unanswered questions. The intrigue lies in how the disguise didn't just hide the killer's face. It hid their intent in plain sight. A clown at your door is unexpected, but it's not inherently threatening. That's the psychological trap. The human brain relies on context to assess danger, and the context here was all wrong. By the time the true nature of the visit was revealed, it was too late. From a behavioral perspective, the choice of a clown costume also suggests a certain mindset. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It required planning, acquiring the outfit, the props, the means of escape. It required confidence that the disguise would work, that the victim would open the door, that the witnesses would be too stunned to react effectively. This level of preparation points to someone who understood both the logistics of the crime and the psychology of the people involved. The cover-up was aided by the fact that the killer could vanish in a normal life almost instantly. Without the wig, the makeup, the costume, they were unremarkable. The disguise was both a spotlight and a shield, drawing all the attention in the moment, then leaving nothing tangible behind. The psychological weight of the case on the community was immense. It turned a symbol of joy into a symbol of fear. For years, the story was retold in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about how appearances can deceive. It became a reminder that danger can arrive dressed as delight, that the things we trust most can be turned against us. Eventually, advances in forensic science and the persistence of investigators began to strip away the layers of the cover-up. The costume had hidden the killer's identity, but it could not erase the connections, the motives, the human relationships that had set the crime in motion. The truth, when it emerged, was both shocking and mundane. Shocking in the betrayal it revealed, mundane in the all-too-human motives of jealousy and resentment. The murder by clown case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the masks people wear, literal or metaphorical, can be more dangerous than the weapons they carry. It shows how easily trust can be manipulated, how perception can be hijacked, and how the most grotesque acts can be hidden behind a smile. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the clown was never just a disguise. It was a message, a statement that the killer could invade the most innocent spaces, twist the most harmless symbols, and leave behind a story so strange that it would echo for decades. Because in the end, the real horror was not the costume itself. It was the realization that the person wearing it had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when joy could be turned into terror. Aileen Seidan case. Found dead in motel room. Layers of mystery. But this is not a story about the bruises or the bloodstains. It's about the psychology of entanglement, the mystery of a relationship that blurred every boundary, and the cover-up. Not in shredded paperwork or erased footage, but in the shifting stories, the silences, and the power dynamics that kept the truth buried until it was too late. In April 2018, 31-year-old Aileen Seidan checked into room 15 of a small Florida motel. She wasn't alone. With her were Zachary Abel and Christina Araujo, two people she wasn't just traveling with, but romantically involved with. The three were in what's known as a throuple, a polyamorous relationship that, in theory, is built on openness and equality. But in practice, theirs was a volatile triangle, one where jealousy, control, and manipulation had begun to erode whatever trust once existed. The psychology of this case begins with triadic tension. In any relationship involving three people, the balance is fragile. Alliances form and shift. One person can become the odd one out, triggering feelings of exclusion and resentment. Friends of Aileen later described exactly that pattern. Moments when she was sidelined, moments when the affection between the other two seemed to come at her expense. In such an environment, emotions don't just simmer, they boil. Aileen's friends also spoke of abuse, physical, emotional, and sustained. She confided that Zachary had hurt her, that Christina had too. Yet she didn't go to the police. Part of that was fear. Christina's family had ties to law enforcement, and Aileen believed that meant there would be no protection for her. This is where learned helplessness comes into play, when repeated harm, combined with the belief that no one will intervene, leads a person to stop seeking help altogether. The mystery deepens when we look at the days leading up to her death. Aileen was on a road trip with Zachary and Christina, far from her home in Miami. She reached out to a friend, asking for help, but the distance, and perhaps the complexity of her situation, meant that help never came. Within days, she was dead. Her body was found dumped at the end of a cul-de-sac, miles from the motel where she had been staying. The motel room itself told a story, one of violence, of struggle, but the official narrative would take time to form. In the meantime, the cover-up began, not necessarily in the form of elaborate lies, but in the way the suspects initially presented themselves. They didn't confess. They didn't flee in a way that drew immediate suspicion. Instead, they relied on the chaos of the situation, on the fact that Aileen's life and relationships were complicated enough to make the truth harder to untangle. From a psychological perspective, this is narrative manipulation. When the victim's life can be painted as messy, unstable, or unconventional, it becomes easier for the perpetrators to muddy the waters. The focus shifts from the act itself to the victim's choices, subtly reframing the story in a way that buys time and sows doubt. The intrigue also lies in the power imbalance within the throuple. Zachary and Christina had a shared history, a shared home, and, crucially, a shared loyalty to each other that outweighed their loyalty to Aileen. In group psychology, this is coalition formation, two members aligning against the third, consciously or unconsciously, to protect their own bond. In this case, that alignment would prove deadly. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding evidence. It was about controlling perception. In the aftermath, friends and family were left piecing together fragments, texts, phone calls, offhand comments, trying to reconcile the Aileen they knew with the circumstances of her death. The suspects, meanwhile, could exploit the fact that polyamorous relationships are still misunderstood by much of the public. The unconventional nature of the relationship became a distraction, a talking point, something that could overshadow the brutality of what had happened. The mystery persisted because the crime wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The abuse Aileen endured had already isolated her, making it harder for her to leave, harder for her to trust outsiders. By the time she was in that motel room, the trap had already been set, not with ropes or locks, but with months of conditioning, intimidation, and control. When the truth began to emerge, it was through the persistence of investigators who refused to be distracted by the noise. They traced the connections, examined the dynamics, and saw the pattern, a relationship that had turned predatory, a victim who had been systematically disempowered, and two people whose loyalty to each other became a pact of silence. From a behavioral standpoint, the aftermath of the crime is telling. People who commit such acts often reveal themselves not in the moment, but in how they behave afterward, what they say, what they avoid saying, how they attempt to manage the narrative. In this case, the attempts to deflect suspicion only underscored the bond between the two surviving members of the throuple, a bond that investigators would eventually break through. The Aileen Seidan case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that danger doesn't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes it comes from the people we trust most, the ones we share our lives with, the ones who know our vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. It shows how abuse can be hidden in plain sight, how fear can silence even the strongest voices, and how the complexity of human relationships can be used as a shield against accountability. And perhaps the most haunting part is the way the layers of mystery still cling to the story. Even with convictions, even with the facts laid out in court, there are questions that will never be fully answered. What exactly happened in room 15? At what point did the decision to kill become final? And could anything have been done to save her in those final hours? Because in the end, this is not just a story about a murder in a motel room. It's a story about control, about the psychology of isolation, and about the way truth can be obscured not just by lies, but by the complexity of the human heart. It's a reminder that the most dangerous cover-ups are not always the ones that hide the act. They're the ones that hide the intent, the ones that make us question whether we ever really knew the people involved at all. Nature-based killings, outdoor crime scenes, beauty turned sinister. But this is not a story about the forensic grids or the numbered evidence markers in the grass. It's about the psychology of killers who choose nature as their stage, the mystery of why the most beautiful places can become the most dangerous, and the cover-up, not in erased fingerprints, but in the way the wilderness itself conspires to hide the truth. There's something primal about the outdoors. Forests, mountains, rivers, they carry an ancient sense of safety and danger intertwined. For most, these places are escapes from the noise of life. For a certain kind of predator, they are the perfect hunting ground. In the open air, there are no walls, no cameras, no neighbors to hear a scream. The killer doesn't just commit the crime in nature, they use nature as an accomplice. The psychology begins with environmental control. Choosing a remote location isn't just about avoiding witnesses. It's about shaping the entire crime to their advantage. In the wilderness, time works differently. Evidence decays faster under sun and rain. Tracks are erased by wind, by animals, by the shifting of the earth itself. A body in a city is a problem to be solved. A body in the woods can become a mystery that lasts decades. The mystery deepens when we ask, why here? Why not the anonymity of a crowded street or the chaos of an urban alley? The answer lies in the killer's relationship with control. In nature, they can dictate the pace. They can choose the moment, the angle, the escape route. They can vanish into the same landscape that swallowed their victim. And if they know the terrain better than anyone else, they hold an advantage that no amount of police training can erase. From a psychological standpoint, there's also the element of symbolic dominance. Taking a life in a place of beauty is a way of corrupting it, of leaving a stain that only they know is there. It's a private victory, a secret mark on the world. For some, that's part of the thrill, not just ending a life, but altering the meaning of a place forever. The cover-up in these cases is often built into the setting. Nature is a master of concealment. Leaves fall, snow covers, rivers carry away, predators scatter remains. The killer doesn't have to hide every trace. They just have to wait for the environment to do it for them. This is passive concealment, letting time and the elements erase the story. But the intrigue lies in the fact that nature doesn't just hide the crime. It can also hide the killer. In small towns near national parks or rural trails, the suspect could be a neighbor, a coworker, the person who volunteers at the visitor center. They blend into the community, their knowledge of the land seen as a virtue, not a threat. And because the crime scene is so far from home, suspicion rarely falls on them. Investigators face a unique psychological challenge in these cases. The wilderness is vast, and the human mind struggles with vastness. We're wired to think in terms of rooms, streets, neighborhoods, not thousands of acres of forest. That scale can make the crime feel unsolvable, which in turn can sap urgency. The killer counts on that. They count on the idea that the search will be called off, that the trail will go cold, that the story will fade. The mystery also thrives on the ambiguity of cause. In nature, death can be explained away, at least at first glance. A fall from a cliff, an animal attack, exposure to the elements. Without clear evidence of foul play, a suspicious death can be written off as an accident. And once that label is applied, it's hard to remove. The killer knows this. They choose methods and locations that mimic the randomness of nature, folding their crime into the landscape's own dangers. The cover-up can also extend to the social sphere. In tight-knit rural communities, there's often a reluctance to believe that one of their own could be responsible. Outsiders are blamed. Strangers are feared. This in-group bias can protect the real perpetrator, especially if they're well-liked or hold a position of trust. The killer can even join in the search, walk the same trails with volunteers, and watch as others unknowingly pass over the very ground where the truth lies buried. From a behavioral perspective, killers who operate in nature often display patience. They're willing to wait for the right moment, to stalk without being seen, to let days or weeks pass before acting. This patience is a form of psychological discipline, and it makes them harder to catch. They're not driven by impulse alone. They're strategists, using the environment as both weapon and shield. The intrigue is heightened by the fact that nature-based killings often leave behind more questions than answers. Even when remains are found, the elements may have erased key evidence. The timeline becomes murky. The cause of death may be impossible to determine. And without those anchors, the investigation drifts. The killer's story, if they ever tell it, becomes the only complete version, and they have no reason to share it. These cases force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that beauty and danger are not opposites. They are often intertwined. The same trail that offers peace to one person can be the perfect trap for another. The same river that reflects the sky can carry away the last trace of a life. And the same forest that shelters wildlife can shelter a predator who walks on two legs. The psychology of nature-based killings is not just about the mind of the killer, it's about the mind of the place. Landscapes have personalities. Some are open and exposed, others secretive and shadowed. The killer chooses a place that matches their intent, a place that will work with them, not against them. And once the crime is done, that place keeps its secrets. The cover-up, in the end, is a collaboration between human malice and natural indifference. The killer doesn't have to erase every trace. They just have to let the wind, the rain, and the passing seasons do their work. And when the searchers go home, when the headlines fade, the land remains, silent and unchanged to the casual eye, but forever altered in ways only the killer understands. Because in the end, nature-based killings are not just about the act itself. They're about the transformation of a place from sanctuary to crime scene, from beauty to horror. They're about the way a killer can step into the most peaceful setting and leave behind a story that will never be fully told. And they're about the unsettling truth that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the bear, or the cliff, or the storm. It's the person who knows exactly how to use them. The disappearance of Maura Murray, college student, vanishes, haunting ambiguity. On a cold February evening in 2004, a 21-year-old nursing student named Maura Murray stepped out of the known world and into the realm of enduring mystery. She left behind a stalled car on a rural New Hampshire road, a scattering of personal belongings, and a silence so deep it has echoed for more than 2 decades. What happened in those final moments before she vanished is not just a question of fact. It's a question of psychology, of human behavior under pressure, of the strange ways truth can be hidden in plain sight. Maura's life, in the days leading up to her disappearance, was a study in contradictions. To some, she was the disciplined, high-achieving young woman who had once attended West Point, who excelled in athletics, who was on track to become a nurse. To others, she was a restless spirit, someone who carried private burdens, who made sudden, unexplained decisions, and who seemed to be quietly navigating a storm no one else could see. In the week before she vanished, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible, that something was shifting. A troubling phone call at work that left her in tears. A sudden decision to email her professors, claiming she'd be away for a family emergency that didn't exist. A flurry of internet searches for lodging in the mountains of Vermont and New Hampshire. These are not the actions of someone following a predictable script. They are the breadcrumbs of a mind in motion, perhaps in turmoil, perhaps in transition. Psychologists often speak of flight behavior, the impulse to escape, to remove oneself from a situation that feels unbearable. It can be triggered by stress, shame, fear, or the quiet accumulation of unresolved problems. But flight doesn't always mean running from danger. Sometimes it's running toward an imagined refuge, a place where the noise of life finally stops. Was Maura seeking that refuge? Or was she being drawn into something far darker? The night she disappeared, her car was found facing the wrong direction on a snow-lined road. The damage was minor, the airbags deployed. A witness saw her, seemingly uninjured, standing outside the vehicle. Minutes later, when police arrived, she was gone. No footprints leading into the woods. No sign of a struggle, just absence. It is here that the mystery deepens, not in the physical evidence, but in the psychological shadows. People vanish for many reasons: voluntary disappearance, foul play, accident. But what makes Maura's case so haunting is the way each theory seems both plausible and incomplete. If she left willingly, why abandon her belongings, including her phone and credit cards? If she was taken, how did it happen so quickly, in such a narrow window of time? And if she wandered into the wilderness, why has no trace been found despite exhaustive searches? The human mind craves closure. We are wired to complete patterns, to fill in missing pieces. But in Maura's case, every attempt to do so leads to more questions. Her story has become a canvas onto which strangers project their own fears, their own theories, their own need for resolution. Some see her as a victim of random violence. Others believe she staged her disappearance to start anew. Still others suspect a cover-up, an accident or crime concealed by those who knew her, or by those who should have been looking for her. Cover-ups, by their nature, thrive in ambiguity. They rely on the absence of definitive proof, on the erosion of memory, on the slow fading of urgency. In the years since Maura vanished, there have been whispers about inconsistencies in witness statements, about evidence that was never fully explained, about the possibility that key details were overlooked or deliberately obscured. Whether these whispers hold truth or are simply the byproduct of obsession is part of the enigma. What is undeniable is the psychological toll this case has taken, not only on Maura's family, but on the countless strangers who have become entangled in it. Online forums dissect her every move. Amateur investigators pore over maps, timelines, and police reports. Each new theory offers the illusion of progress, yet the core mystery remains untouched. There is a peculiar intimacy in following a case like this. You begin to feel as though you know the person at its center, even though you've never met. You imagine their thoughts, their fears, their final moments. But this intimacy is an illusion. The truth is, Maura Murray exists now as both a real person and a symbol of how fragile the line is between the ordinary and the unthinkable. In the psychology of disappearance, there is often a moment, a pivot point, when the trajectory of a life changes forever. Sometimes it's a conscious decision. Sometimes it's the result of forces beyond control. For Maura, that moment may have come long before her car stopped on Route 112. It may have been building for weeks, months, even years. And yet, there is another possibility, one that chills the mind. That her disappearance was not the culmination of her own choices, but the intrusion of someone else's. A stranger passing by, a familiar face with hidden intentions, a chance encounter that became a point of no return. The intrigue lies in the fact that both possibilities, self-initiated flight and external harm, can coexist in the same narrative. A person can be running from something and still be caught by something else. The human story is rarely linear. As the years pass, the case has taken on a mythic quality. It is no longer just about one young woman's fate. It is about the nature of truth itself. How it can be fractured, refracted, and reshaped by time. How it can be guarded, whether by accident or design. How it can slip beyond reach, leaving only fragments for us to interpret. In the end, the disappearance of Maura Murray is not just a mystery to be solved. It is a mirror. It reflects our own need for answers, our discomfort with uncertainty, our tendency to weave narratives from incomplete threads. It forces us to confront the unsettling reality that some stories may never be resolved, that some doors remain closed no matter how hard we knock. And perhaps that is the final psychological twist, that the very absence of resolution is what keeps us coming back. That in the space where truth should be, we find something else, something that speaks to the deepest parts of the human mind. The part that fears the unknown, the part that hungers for meaning, the part that understands, on some level, that mystery is not just a puzzle to be solved, but a shadow we live alongside. Maura Murray stepped into that shadow on a winter night in 2004. And in that shadow, she remains, an enduring question, a haunting ambiguity, a reminder that the line between presence and absence can be crossed in an instant, and that once crossed, it may never be retraced. The Angie Dodge case. DNA twists, wrongful conviction, justice distorted. In the twilight of a small Idaho town, life carried on in hushed routines until one morning tore the veil of normalcy. A young woman vanished into the shadows of her own home, and the question that echoed wasn't who did this, but who could be trusted to find the truth. Beneath the polished image of a tight-knit community lay an undercurrent of secrets waiting to be unearthed. This isn't a story of blood and gore. It's a tale of minds manipulated, evidence bent, and justice warped by human frailty. From the moment investigators crossed the threshold of that ordinary house, their minds raced to impose order on chaos. Yet in that frantic need for closure, subtle biases began to shape the narrative. They saw patterns where none existed. A witness's half-remembered description morphed into a suspect's portrait. Every contradictory detail was brushed aside like unwanted dust. Here, the most dangerous culprit wasn't lurking in the dark. It was the conviction that their theory couldn't be wrong. Enter the first arrest, a local man whose life was already marked by hardship and small scandals. He fit the profile too neatly, a cautionary example of how our need for villains blinds us to innocence. Interrogators wielded confidence like a weapon, edging him toward confession with questions that danced around the truth. His sense of self crumbled under pressure, forging memories he never lived and words he never spoke. The community exhaled relief even as a grave injustice was taking root. In the months that followed, the machinery of prosecution churned forward with relentless momentum. Witness testimony, forensic experts, and media sound bites aligned to paint a seamless picture of guilt. But beneath the surface, whispers of doubt grew louder. Friends who knew him since childhood sensed the dissonance between his character and the crimes he was accused of. Their pleas dissolved into static against the roar of official certainty. The first lesson emerged. Once the narrative is set, truth is an inconvenient guest. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, pieces of evidence were gathering dust or quietly disappearing. Swabs that might have told a different story ended up locked away, cataloged but never examined. Phone records that hinted at other suspects were deemed irrelevant. Each decision seemed innocuous alone, yet together they formed a labyrinth designed to mislead rather than illuminate. This wasn't mere oversight. This was a cover-up sculpted by human short-sightedness and ambition. Years passed, and the convicted man languished behind bars as his life outside decayed like an abandoned house. Letters home spoke of shattered hope, of legal briefs filing thick binders while real answers remained elusive. His supporters held fast, building a quiet movement fueled by faith in DNA, science's impartial voice. They treasured every contradiction in the official account, every fragment of unexamined material. Each moment of delay widened the chasm between what was known and what was claimed. Then, in the age of genetic genealogy, a new door cracked open. Tiny fragments of DNA, previously overlooked, whispered secrets of another life, one that didn't belong to the wrongfully convicted. Databases built for family connections revealed a trail leading to a man whose name had never crossed investigators' lips. It was as if a second mind reached out from the past to correct the record, forcing the system to confront its own mistakes. That man, living an unremarkable existence, shared none of the earlier suspects' vulnerabilities. He moved freely among neighbors who never suspected the darkness behind his ordinary routine. A psychological portrait emerged of someone adept at slipping into the background, who understood the power of anonymity in plain sight. His quiet facade hid an unsettling calm, an unyielding confidence that the world would never look too closely at him. As the truth clawed its way back into daylight, the convicted man walked free, but the scars remained. Years lost can never be rewound, and trust in institutions bore deep fissures. The community, once united in horror, now fractured under the weight of betrayal. Friends turned skeptics, families demanded answers, and collective memory became tangled in regret and denial. The biggest mystery wasn't who committed the crime. It was how so many minds could be led astray. In the aftermath, the courtroom became a stage for untold dramas. Apologies uttered with cautious lips, lawsuits filed like bitter parting gifts, and the relentless question of accountability. Prosecutors who once championed the original verdict now scrambled to explain decisions that, in hindsight, reeked of haste. Forensic experts, too, faced scrutiny as the reliability of their methods came under fire. Every revelation peeled back another layer of collective blindness. Today, the Angie Dodge case stands as proof that justice is a fragile construct, precariously held together by human judgment. It reminds us that every investigator, every juror, every voice in the courtroom carries the weight of shaping reality. And when we succumb to cognitive shortcuts, confirmation bias, tunnel vision, the luxury of certainty, we build castles on sand. Only by embracing doubt, rigorously questioning assumptions, and guarding against the lure of easy answers can we hope to uphold the promise of true justice. In the end, this is not just a story of one crime or one miscarriage of law. It is a mirror reflecting our own vulnerabilities, our propensity to believe what we want to believe. Whatever answers we think we hold may be shadows cast by incomplete truths. And if we fail to confront that, we risk trading the scales of justice for a skewed narrative, one in which distortion becomes the dominant force. Let this be a lesson carved into the ledger of history: vigilance over comfort, truth over certainty, and the courage to challenge the narrative.